Hello friends. This is Fanfic Adventure. How are you all? So in this video, we will see. What if Naruto get married with Nico Robin and got Harem? But before we start, if you want more amazing stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also if possible share this video with your friends. Now without wasting any more time, let's begin the story. She was standing in complete darkness. The only thing she knew was that she could hear a dripping sound, but there was something else too. Sobs. The sobs of a child. Robin turned her head in the direction of the crying. Who else could be in such a place? Slowly but determinedly she walked straight toward the source of the sounds and abruptly stopped. Huddled and wounded, a little boy wiped weakly. His blonde hair was scrubby and on a streak next to his temple was scarlet red blood. But even if the little boy seemed hurt and lonely, Robin just couldn't bring herself to approach him, not to mention console him. But she didn't have to because the boy seemed to notice somebody was watching him. He briskly turned around, showing his appalled face. His in fear widened eyes reflected Robin's own loneliness. "WH. Who are you?" he asked with a trembling voice, although there was also a slight hint of anger in it. "What do you want from me? Do you want to insult me? Tell me that I'm a monster too? Are you going to hurt me?" Anybody that would have known Robin well enough would have seen how she flinched slightly when the boy mentioned the word monster. Unfortunately, there wasn't anybody anymore in this accursed world to know her this well. She had been robbed of everything and was made an outlaw by the government. She too had been called a monster, and as such she had to be as cold as ice in order to survive. As she didn't respond to his question, the boy stood up and glared at her, a challenging look in his eyes instead of fear. Finally, after an eternity of silent observation, she retorted to his questions. "Who I am is none of your business. I don't have the intention to harm you, so you shouldn't bother about a kid." The child's reaction was unexpected. He furiously stamped on the ground while his finger on her. "Don't call me kid. After all, I'm the next Hokage." Robin started to wonder. She had never heard of a Hokage, a fire shadow, so far. If it had appeared in one of the history books, she surely would have remembered it. But now she began to notice something else. This child was talking in one of the old languages. One of those that went lost with the time and the poneglyphs. She just couldn't believe that somebody else could have mastered it. Who? She began to ask, but was cut off by the roar of an animal, maybe the howl of a true monster. She felt as if her eardrum was about to rip apart. Just like her, the little boy clutched his hands on his ears and strained his face in pain. A strong wind began to blow and felt how her feet lift off the ground and she lost consciousness. "Hey Robin, wake up. Get up. There is something you might have to take a look at." Somebody shook her, but she still wanted to pursue the dream she had. Who was that boy? How could he know the language of the poneglyphs? And why had their eyes been so similar? But it was no good. Nami had woken her up so ruggedly it was impossible to fall asleep again. The quick and loud footsteps on deck didn't help either. She gazed at the wooden ceiling of the Thousand Sunny. She had that dream again. From when she had been a little girl she had had this dream of a child. It pursued her again and again, always leaving her with questions. Robin tried to remember the boy's face, but whenever she did so, it always began to become blurry in front of her. The only thing staying clearly in her memories was his look, his loneliness, his fear and anger that his eyes were reflecting. "Robin, what are you doing? There's something in the ocean," exclaimed her Captain Monkey D. Luffy from the deck. She jumped off the bed which she had been reading on before sleep had overwhelmed her. The fight with Mariah had been exhausting and nerve-wracking for everyone, especially for Zoro. The exception was Luffy who, with Sanji's unexpected help, now tried to scare Usopp with some ghost stories, which to some extent still seemed to work. Nami held the spyglass in her hand and stared spellbound at a small point while Luffy tried to take a look through the binoculars, which Sanji tried to prevent with all his might. All fun ended when the ladies were involved. When Robin came close to her, Nami pointed wordlessly on the point in the distance and stored the spyglass back into the bag where she kept the few measuring instruments she needed for protocoling the weather and for cartography. "What do you think it is, Robin? Could you take a look with your powers? This fog makes it impossible to spot anything," said the navigator, still staring at the dark dot in the water with a worried look. "Sure," was Robin's short answer. She crossed her arms elegantly as she always did when she used her devil fruit powers. She closed her eyes and made another appear on the unknown object, Her thoughts concentrated on it. She opened the eye and looked around. It was a big piece of wood. Most probably it had been part of one of the ships that must have had tried to cross the triangle. But there was also something else. She moved her eyeball to the right. She would have flinched if she hadn't concentrated that much on her powers. Somebody was clinging onto the wood, and although she couldn't see his face, she was sure that the person was unconscious or maybe just dead. He was wearing a black, somewhat baggy jacket with a bit of orange on it. Everything else was out of sight. The eye dissolved and Robin was back on the ship again, where everybody was waiting anxiously, or in Luffy's case excitedly, for her to tell them what was floating out there in the waters. It's a person. He is unconscious. He and his crew probably shipwrecked while crossing the triangle. Robin explained to the crew that immediately started to discuss the matter. Chopper and Usopp immediately got worked up, running around and screaming that it was another trap set by Mariah. Nami just wanted to find out more and began asking further details from Robin, while the rest of their nakama began to speculate about where that mysterious person came from and if it was too risky to take him on board. Luffy, on the other hand, stared at the dark spot, frowned, stretched out his rubber arm and got a hold of the person Robin had described. "Hey guys, look! I got him!" he exclaimed, grinning like a loon, while Usopp and Chopper looked like they were about to faint. With everything they had been through together, everybody knew by now how to dodge these mortal catches of Luffy's. Everyone but Frankie and Brook. Both did not have time to duck anymore and so received the flying object along with Luffy's fist into their guts. Saying that they were severely pissed would be the understatement of the century. Even as the captain, the ship carpenter, musician, cook and swordsman argued about how to take a shipwrecked person on board next time, the crew's doctor began to examine the unfortunate boy. Mind to say, from behind Usopp's leg a good distance away. Chopper didn't know if the youngster had really been unconscious before, but he definitely was out cold now. Robin also came closer and stared at the stranger's face that was covered with bruises and cuts as well as grime the seawater hadn't managed to wash off. His right eye was a bit swollen with a blue-purplish hue around it. His wet, blonde hair was plastered against his face, some streaks still revealing that when dry it would be tousled. Robin had the distinct feeling that she knew this boy. She couldn't really describe it. It was a feeling like when you come across a person you had once bypassed on a street a long time ago. "Robin, are you all right?" Nami asked hesitantly, kneeling beside her to get a better look of the boy too. Robin blinked and schooled her expression again. She hadn't noticed herself frowning. "Whoa, looks like he has seen better days already," Nami commented, face scrunched up in a grimace. "But how do we find out what crew he belongs to? He could be a pirate, but..." There's a strange symbol on his headband. Maybe that'll give us some answers," remarked Usopp, after deeming it not too dangerous to approach the mysterious guy, glancing at the spiral-like symbol that reminded him of a leaf. Chopper, who had been hiding behind Usopp all that time, out of precaution prodded the stranger's leg with his hooves and then began his diagnosis, examining the teenager's arms, legs and so on. "Looks like he got beaten up pretty badly some time ago and then fought again afterwards," Chopper murmured expertly while searching for any head wounds, since some old, crusted blood was sticking to the blonde hair. "A lot of bruises. His right arm might be broken too. It would be better if I take him to the sick bay." And with that he went into heavy point, taking his new charge into his arms. The boy groaned as Chopper touched his bad arm and shoulder, making the doctor furrow his brows while taking him away with Usopp and Luffy in tow. Nami gave Robin a piercing stare, which the archaeologist returned calmly. "Hey Robin, you don't know this person, do you?" she whispered so that nobody could hear them. "No," replied Robin, not knowing she was wrong. Even under Chopper's diligent care and even after Nami had put Luffy and Usopp back into place with her iron fist, since both of them wouldn't stop pestering the doctor, the stranger gave no indication of returning to the world of the living anytime soon. It worried the little reindeer just as much as it seemed logical to him. They had, after all, fished the poor lad out of the cold water, and some of the injuries he had suffered were quite serious. It reminded him of some of the injuries his own crewmates had sustained during one of the many battles they had fought up until now, the most recent on Thriller Bark. All he could hope now was that the medicine he had given him and lots of rest would help the blonde recover from whatever ordeal he had gone through. While the reindeer's thoughts were mostly focused on his patient, so were Robin's. It puzzled her that a boy she had just come across held such a sense of familiarity. She did not tell that anyone though. As she Nami and Usopp scoured through various books in the ship's library, in search for the smallest hint as to what the symbol of the boy's headband could mean. Robin tried her best to remember all the faces from her time on the run. She had already discarded the thought of him being a survivor of Ohara once she had had a good look at his face, free of grime and blood. The boy was far too young to have been born at that time. He'd have had to be at least 20, but he looked barely like 16. When they turned up with nothing and when their passenger still remained in dreamland, they gave up their search, simply hoping that soon they could ask the boy directly. It was the 4th day now, since they had taken him in, and the sun shone down brightly, not a single cloud staining the bright blue sky. It improved the crew's mood incredibly after having spent some time in the misty Florian Triangle. There had been a bit of sun piercing the darkness at some point, but it vanished quickly after they left the gigantic ship that had housed Giko Mariah and his army of zombies. The two women were sitting in the aquarium bar, both engrossed in some writing, or in Nami's case the newspaper a gull had brought over just an hour ago. Outside the boys had been so loud it was hard to concentrate. It was quiet now, although just a few seconds ago Sanji had come dancing into the room, wanting to know if both of them would like to have a drink. Robin had gone for her usual coffee, smiling at him, while Nami declined, way too interested into one of the articles to bother with the lovesick cook. Not discouraged in the least, he leapt out of the room, promising to bring her something special anyway. Nami shook her head in amusement and annoyance behind the papers. Robin looked up as the orange-haired woman flipped a paper, heaving a sigh. There are more and more coups d'état going on. It's getting a bit out of hand. I wonder what's coming next, she said, lying her head back into her neck so that she could spot a telltale green vest through a small opening of the aquarium. The boys had left it open while they were fishing outside beside it. Robin gave her a nod. She knew what was going on inside the girl's head just by the look on her face. The revelation of the revolutionary dragon being Luffy's father had changed the view on some things concerning their captain, but it did not change anything about their loyalty towards him. Suddenly there was a commotion, and even through the thick wood and water around them Luffy's excited voice was loud and clear. Land, ho! Both women smiled in their own way. They probably would never find out how their captain managed to be so loud even when his voice should not be carried down here by all rights. They got up and headed for the deck. Indeed, in the distance a small island was visible. A tangled mass of trees with birds circling the mountain top. Checking her log port on her wrist, Nami smiled brightly. The needle was pointing directly at the small, lush and green landmass. Okay, everyone, get ready, we are going to set anchor on that island. Excited cries and cheers came from the whole crew, Luffy jumping up and grabbing the mast so that he could take an even better look at their destination. Chopper, you take care of the helm, everyone else to their usual positions. In no time the boys were running around excitedly, all the while Nami barked orders at them when they started bickering or doing foolish idiocies that could harm their ship, Frankie joining in with a loud outraged cry. As Robin still stood beside her, the hands she had summoned helping with the sail, she noticed Nami's face scrunching up as she examined the needle on her log port intently, as though she could not believe what she was seeing. Is something the matter? She asked, not missing a beat in her 12 hands making sailor's knots to secure some cargo that would have rolled around deck otherwise. Nami did not respond immediately, instead watching the sky for a moment as though she was expecting lightning to strike them here and now. The ginger shook her head like an adult would with a child that was being silly. I am not sure, but I get the feeling that the log port hadn't been pointing to this island. She looked thoughtful, and Robin, there was still more coming. I can feel that the weather is changing too, she mumbled, more to herself actually. Robin's blue eyes scanned the sky for anomalies, but it just looked as blue, clear and innocent as it had the whole day. Still, she had to admit that Nami most definitely was much attuned with her surroundings and the atmosphere, as she had noticed. Nami was one of those very few whose bodies reacted according to the change in pressure of the air, a gift that came in handy with the inconsistent and unpredictable weather of the Grand Line. Although it did seem to come at a price, since Nami would complain about slight headaches from time to time. A shadow in the kitchen door's porthole caught Robin's attention as she finally released her devil fruit powers. It had been swift and barely perceptible, but there had been movement behind it. Quietly and carefully she crossed her arms and made eyes appear in all possible hiding places, especially in the kitchen. Finding nothing, she decided to try her luck with the medical bay, but to her surprise it hadn't been the boy, since he still lay on the bed out cold. Zoro, who had also worked on securing barrels, suddenly caught the slight frown on her face. Something wrong? he asked in his usual voice, eyeing her. Robin smiled simply, knowing that sometimes she could irk an entertaining reaction from the swordsman if he was tired enough. It's nothing. I just thought I saw something, but everything is fine. The green-haired male grunted gruffly to her simple answer, ready to get some shut-eye as soon as possible. Robin, on the other hand, stayed where she was until finally they sat anchor. The whole island was a jungle reminiscent of Little Garden, though it lacked the gigantic prehistoric beasts and two giants. Dark trees, whose branches were heavy with ripe fruits and leaves, blocked the view towards the heart of the island where a huge hill towered over everything. It had taken some effort to persuade Luffy that their exploration would have to wait until tomorrow, but eventually he relented when Sanji and Nami suggested they go explore the island with a lunchbox the cook would prepare. That shut their captain up for a bit, and right now, as the sun was sinking lower and lower towards the horizon, the crew was getting ready for dinner when an ear-splitting scream disrupted the peaceful atmosphere on the Thousand Sunny. They all were in front of the med bay in no time, even Frankie, who had just been working on some new transportation in his workshop. Instead of seeing an aggressor trying to cleave their doctor. For why else would someone scream as loudly as he did? They saw Chopper running around in circles frantically as if he was being chased by Skypa's monstrous boa. "Wah, what's going on, Chopper? Why are you screaming?" Usopp asked nervously, glancing from one side of the room to another, awaiting some sort of fiend to attack them now that almost all of them were present. The small deer's eyes were wide as saucer, as his tiny hooves waved frantically. "The boy is gone. I just touched him lightly with my hoof and he just disintegrated into thin air." Frankie, Nami, Usopp and Luffy were staring at him as though he had sprouted a new antler. Robin just tried to assess everything she could see, searching for an indication as to what might have transpired. "Nobody just disappears into thin air," Nami retorted, but as her eyes fell on the bed she began to grasp why Chopper was so upset. The bed was empty, the covers not shifted in the slightest. Her words seemed to calm the small doctor somewhat, although he still looked incredibly shaken. "But I'm telling you, I was just about to tend to his wounds when he simply vanished. I just wanted to change his bandages, and when I brushed him he just went up in white smoke." The redhead was just about to reply when another loud, outraged yell from two other crew members were carried towards the med bay. Not a second later both Zoro and Sanji had joined them, faces twisted by fury and panting heavily, probably because they had run so fast. "Seems like we've been robbed," Zoro spit, glare intensifying. "Someone stole one of my trousers and the Marimo's missing a shirt," Sanji piped in, earning a fierce look from his rival for the nickname. A switch turned inside Robin's head as she remembered the shadow she had noticed earlier today. Instantly she let an eye grow on the side of the ship. Her suspicion was confirmed when the single orb caught sight of footprints in the moist sand of the beach, leading towards the jungle. He kept running and stumbled as his foot got caught in a root sticking out from the stump of an uprooted tree when the memories of his shadow clone came rushing inside his head, breaking his concentration. Naruto breathed heavily as he pressed his hand on his injured right shoulder. Fervently cursing under his breath he pulled himself together and got up again. Now they were sure to know he had escaped and it wouldn't be long until they would come after him, that he was sure of. Naruto didn't allow himself to ponder too much about where he was and how he had ended up here. Nothing else but getting back to Konoha mattered. He had a bad feeling, a feeling that told him that something even more terrible than Nagato's attack on the village would occur. First off he had to look for a village or a town so that he could figure out where was. The rest he could care about later. Night fell upon him and its darkness mingled with the dense jungle canopy above him. He stared into the darkness ahead and in front of his bleary eyes appeared Sasuke's face, sending a hostile glare his way as he turned towards the shadows. He was overcome by a wave of nausea and heaved up on the spot. Propped against a tree with his other unharmed arm, he waited until he felt that the fit was over. Naruto repeatedly breathed in deeply and wiped his mouth with the tail of the shirt he had snatched when he could not find his own clothes. He could feel his legs being unable to support him any longer and slid onto the forest floor, his back against the bark of the tree. "What should I do? What do I have to do so that everything will be all right again?" he muttered forlornly, staring fixedly at a lone star that had managed to send its light through the thick canopy of leaves. So many things had gone wrong in such a short amount of time. By now he had a hard time to keep track of everything, which was already difficult enough without all the useless details. First, they had yet again failed at catching up with Sasuke, and to cap it all, Itachi had left him to ponder about the meaning of his last words. He couldn't care less about what Sasuke's brother did and wanted, but he had a hunch that the rogue ninja had more or less left his younger brother's well-being in his hands. And even though, in his opinion, Itachi did not deserve to have anyone comply to his wishes, Naruto had his very own reasons why this long-winded, last request, for there was no more doubt that Itachi was dead, hit home with him. Though the thought of those mysterious powers that had been transmitted to him, and especially how they had been transmitted, made him shudder. But to add insult to injury, after having proclaimed to the black-haired man that he would protect both Konoha and Sasuke, the masked member of Akatsuki had toyed with them until it was too late to reach Sasuke. And just as they had returned, he and his comrades drained, empty-handed and frustrated, he was told that the only man who had been like a grandfather to him had been murdered by his former student. The thought still left him with a bitter aftertaste, and with great effort did he manage to swallow back the tears that threatened to be spilled. He had forgiven Tsunade during his stay at Mt. Myoboku. By now he had come to realize that she must have hurt just as much as he had. Nevertheless, he still was angry that she had not tried harder to stir him from his resolve. He was convinced that as Hokage she would have had the means to do so. His departure to Mt. Myoboku inevitably led his trail of thoughts towards Pain's invasion. Naruto's eyes stared at the ground, but that wasn't what he was seeing. Instead, images plagued him. Of his destroyed home, the feeling of chakra going out when a person died, the stench of curdling blood, the screams of those lucky enough to have survived the first attack, and the silence of the ones who weren't. The very first thought he had been able to formulate once he had been able to suppress the shock was that hopefully none of his friends had died because of him. Images and impressions rushed inside his head with maddening quickness, and he felt ill trying to keep up with it all. He pressed both eyelids onto each other and forced himself to take several deep breaths. He shivered from head to toe and hated himself for being brought down so easily by something like this. Everyone was fine. Nagato had been beaten. No one died. Yet, on the other hand, he had to acknowledge to himself that without Nagato's mercy he never would have seen a lot of his precious people again. He had never felt his own powerlessness as much as he did on that day. But now that this threat had been overcome and that they had survived one of the worst attacks on Konoha in years, that he had not been drawn in by the Kyuubi because of his father's intervention, and hoping he could now fulfill his promise to Sakura, some random ninjas had to arrive and claim that Sasuke had attacked and abducted their sensei. The beating he had endured in order to protect Sasuke had hurt far less than the feeling in his chest. Someone could have driven a kunai inside his heart and it would have been the same. He panted as his breaths began to even out. The cold sweat on his body left him shivering. He looked as though he had plunged into a pond. Exhausted, he propped his head against the uneven bark of the tree. Just what more did Sasuke want? He had killed Itachi, had gotten his revenge. Why? Just why did he still commit crimes, made himself an even bigger target? It was already bad enough that the people of Konoha saw him as an enemy. He did not need to incur the other nation's wrath. Was he now so driven by hate that he could not live any other way? Did everything come down to destruction for him? Without noticing he huddled up, for one because he was cold and because otherwise he would not have been able to contain his emotions. His head went from the bark to his knees. He breathed in the sweet scent from the strange plants. It made him drowsy, made him forget where he was for a moment. He was tempted to close his eyes and surrender to sleep, to simply let go and push everything to the back of his mind for a bit. He was just so very tired. But another face obtruded itself upon his mind's eye, a face framed by dark hair but so much friendlier than the one of his old comrade. The face belonging to that woman he had seen when he had been looking for an escape route on the ship. He knew he had seen her face somewhere before. Just where? Even though most did not believe him, he remembered most of Konoha's citizens. He may not know everyone by name, but it was already enough to memorize their appearance. What was confusing was that he hadn't been able to recognize anybody else when he had jumped overboard the ship, if one could call that thing such. So if she was familiar, she had to be from Konoha, but since he didn't recognize any of the others, she might as well not be. His head began to hurt. He took a deep breath and relaxed. When he opened his eyes again and focused them on the leafy branches above, the light from the star had disappeared. By now it was so dark in the jungle that he couldn't see his own hands. Had he fallen asleep? He hoped not. Maybe those strange people were still on his tail. Now that he had come to rest and gotten over the shock he had experienced when he had woken up in the small teetering room, thousands of questions and thoughts he had deemed unimportant during his breakneck run rushed into his mind. What had happened? Where were Kakashi and Yamato? What happened to the Kumo nins they'd been chasing after? And why on earth was he in a tropical forest when he had just been jumping through the treetops of snow-covered firs? His head buzzed with many open questions and seemingly insurmountable problems. If I stay here, sitting around, I won't be able to sort out anything anyway, he figured with a note of bitterness and willed himself to get up from the moss-covered ground. He looked around once again. Wherever he was, there did not seem to be a village or town in immediate proximity. He groaned. Despite his short rest, he was still exhausted. He could and did not want to cover any greater distances. He would have to spend the night in the open, that much was certain, and if what Kakashi had once told him was true, he better find some hollow tree or a cave for shelter. With a sour expression, he remembered how his sensei had tried to scare him with the false pretense that some disgusting animals and bugs would lodge inside his body while sleeping bleakly. Yet, what was even more unpleasant was that he had believed him, despite denying it loudly. The huge grin behind Kakashi's mask when he had gotten a good look at the dark circles under his eyes the next day, and the smug grin from his rival, never let him forget the humiliation he had felt. His eyes roamed onto a small, bright dot in the distance, and suddenly he felt a spark of hope. Moving quietly and warily towards it, he entered a clearing flooded with moonlight with a lone hill on it. Naruto huffed disappointedly, took a step forward and tripped. Landing face first in a small pit, he got out of it, this time swearing loudly and spitting out sand. He briskly ran his fingers through his hair, brushing the dirt out of them. He noticed too late that he was using his injured right, but he hissed only and took a look at the hole he had blundered into. His eyes widened in astonishment and horror. He stood in an imprint of a giant paw. A clawed paw. A lone bead of sweat trickled down his chin. His throat felt very dry all of a sudden. He looked back to the cluster of trees he'd emerged from. Only now did he notice that most of them looked like they had been overturned and trampled down. He swallowed hard. What the hell? At that moment he heard something behind him paw and growl. He turned around. What he had assumed to be a hill turned out to be an oversized version of a big cat. Staring at the petrified ninja with its steady gold-brown eyes, it opened its maw, showing long and sharp teeth. Naruto got into a position to leap away when a shout rung out from behind him. Onigiri. Out of pure instinct he went flat on the ground, thinking that this was it. Yet, what he had expected never occurred. Instead he heard the beast shriek and go down with a deafening crash. Naruto looked up and straight into the rigid face of the animal. There was neither hide nor hair of his savior. He was about to rise when he felt a cold piece of metal against his throat. His heart hammered loudly in his chest. Well, finally got you," Zoro said smugly and looked down the agitated Naruto from behind. "You gave us a lot of trouble, you know." "Hey," he yelled when Naruto jumped to his feet, trying to get to the other side of the clearing. His right shoulder burned something awful and he could feel the bile rising in his throat again. But he wouldn't let himself be stopped by something like that. Whoever the person was that saved him, he wasn't a friend with the way he'd handled him. He had had some problems understanding the other correctly because of his strange accent, but the tone of his voice spelled trouble. Just as he was about to immerse into the row of trees and make off, the pain spiked so unexpectedly and intensely that he thought his arm had been set on fire and would fall off any minute. His knees gave way and he began to retch. Zoro, witnessing it all, grumbled in reluctance and moved towards the boy, who looked worse for wear. "Okay, you have two options. Either you come back to the ship without causing too much difficulties, or else I'll drag you back there, understood?" In his gaze Naruto could clearly perceive impatience. He could feel something menacing emanating from this man. His eyes caught sight of the dead giant cat and privately he estimated his chances to escape successfully. It didn't look too good. "What is it?" grunted Zoro, pushing with his thumb against the tsuba of the second of his three swords, Shisui. Naruto, realizing he wasn't in any shape to do anything, glared at the man with utmost suspicion. He rose to his feet without exposing any more weakness. Zoro eyed him shortly, assuming the boy would not try anything. He was in no position or condition to pose a serious threat anyway. Naruto took a step forward and Zoro made no move to stop him. Instead he turned around, seized the tiger by its tail so he could bring it back to the ship. At least they would have something to fill the pantry with. If one could trust the assessments of the money-hungry sea which the island was uninhabited. They would have to take care about getting food themselves. Also he did not want to miss a chance to irk the cook by showing his usefulness. "What is it now? What are you waiting for?" Zoro asked gruffly and irritably as he saw the boy scanning the forest on the other side. "Just so you know, you try anything and I'll give you hell." Naruto averted his attention from the trees when he took notice of the harsh voice of the former pirate hunter. But something had attracted his attention. A tuft of long, silvery hair, but that was impossible. Zoro's patience had always been within narrow bounds. Getting tired of the boy's antics, he seized the startled youngster by the collar of his shirt and pulled him next to him. "I'll keep an eye on you. Let's go. I want to return to the sunny," was the only thing he saw, tiger's tail in one hand and hilt from one of his swords in the other, before setting off with Naruto. Naruto did not dare to flee. He knew that if this man was able to kill off the giant tiger with such ease, then he would be beaten in the blink of an eye as he was now. The silence was heavy and not even the sound of the wind seemed to be able to bridge it. They both watched each other intently, anxious not to get caught by their companion. The swordsman had wanted to turn right towards a row of especially eerie-looking trees when something grabbed his sleeve. In one fluid motion he had unsheathed two of his swords and caught Wado Ikimonji, which he had thrown into the air with his teeth and held the blades at the boy's throat. Naruto's pupils were widened in fear. He could feel the sweat gathering on his brow and run down his face. Zoro's eyes were cold and filled with a murderous glint. "What were you trying to pull?" hissed Zoro, turning a blade further up while staring at the boy before looking over the blonde mop of hair and detecting small specks of light in the distance, the thousand sunny. Puzzled, he blinked at the scared teen. So he had only tried to show him the right way. "You wanted to lead me back to the sunny?" he inquired ungraciously, not losing sight of his charge. Naruto did not understand everything, but he was pretty sure the guy had gotten lost on the way back to his own ship. He couldn't else but sweat drop. "Are you stupid?" he asked with a straight face, not expecting an answer. As if he had understood, Zoro's eyes hardened and a vein protruded from his temple. "Shut it!" snapped the swordsman. Naruto swore that for a second he saw two rows of sharp teeth inside the man's mouth. The more time he spent with the guy, the stranger things seemed to get. Zoro put the swords away, but the boy still looked as shaken as when he had seen the tiger getting killed. Aghast, he couldn't stop himself from staring at the swords. He still could feel the coldness of the blades against his skin. He swallowed and waited for what might happen next. One thing was for sure. Angering the man with the swords was a really bad idea. The swordsman only gripped the tail of the slain animal and pointed towards the ship with his head. Naruto's legs felt rather heavy as he followed the man again, the same man that had threatened him with his weapons 2 times in one night. He lightly touched his throat, the same spot where the metal had been, with his left hand. With every new step he took and every inch he walked forward, he thought even more desperately about the fastest way back home. The sense of foreboding that plagued him ever since he had woken up hadn't gone away. On his precipitated escape he hadn't taken the time to take a good look at the vessel he had woken up on. It was big, although definitely not as big as the steel giant that had taken Temujin to the homeland of his ancestors. A warm light shone from the many openings and made the priorly indistinguishable shapes and colors of the forest clearer the closer they got to the ship. Naruto came to a halt and admired this masterpiece of craftsmanship. The brigantine was an unconventional construction but with an appealing design nonetheless. What caught Naruto's eye now was the figurehead in the shape of a lion with a shaggy mane that he would have associated with a sunflower rather than a wild animal. A rope ladder hung down to their side and partially covered a huge red one, painted in the middle of a circle bold framed with black. The watercraft had nothing in common with the dull ships and small rowboats Naruto was used to. This ship radiated life and color. The animated going-on seemingly taking place on deck caused so much ruckus that Naruto did not even have to strain his ears to hear them. Naruto startled when the green-haired man bellowed at him harshly. He hadn't really noticed that he had stopped walking while admiring the ship. By now Zoro was standing next to the ladder and seemingly waited for Naruto to follow him. He was still holding onto the tiger's tail, its tongue flopping between its jaws. Naruto was curious to know just how this mountain of meat was supposed to get on the ship. It was one thing to drag such a beast over the ground, but lifting it. Zoro, for that matter, was on his very last nerve. Ever since taking the brat in, they had had nothing but hassle. Adding to that the fact that the boy had had the audacity to steal one of his shirts and use it as a rag for his vomit had by no means helped him getting on his buddy list, which Zoro could count down on the fingers of both his hands. Same went for the love cook, whose pants, as he could now see, were definitely too tight for the boy. And as he now stood there, head tilted sideways and confused look on his face, he did somewhat remind him of Luffy. Whatever the reason, Zoro found that similarity to be very irritating. "Will you stop gawking and climb up the ladder already?" He could see the brat's shoulders twitch and how he watched him as though he was concerned about ending up like the tiger, which Zoro was planning on throwing over the rail. When nothing happened and Zoro came to the conclusion that probably the idiot hadn't understood a thing, he had already talked gibberish on the way back, and if one went by Luffy standards then it had definitely been an insult, and so motioned towards the ladder with his head. The blonde looked around with a lost expression before he finally took hold of one of the wooden slats and began his ascent, Zoro not too far behind and heaving up the tiger. Zoro barely managed to hide his smirk when wide blue eyes stared at him in wonder. "Just what kind of hole did you crawl out of?" He meant no harm, but he couldn't else but ask. If there was one thing he always kept in mind, it was that they were on the Grand Line, the most dangerous of all seas, filled with individuals like the agents from CP9 or Moria. To him it seemed absurd that anyone could be impressed by something as simple as lifting a tiger. Naruto's eyebrows were drawn together. He had the inkling of an idea what was being said to him, yet all those times he was being addressed by the swordsman he always got the feeling that he somehow misunderstood. Just like now, the guy honestly didn't just ask him if he liked moles, did he? Frustrated because he did not get a reply for his small joke, only this uncertain questioning look, he let it slip and urged the boy to continue climbing. Damn, how much he'd like to have some sake. The noise died down as Naruto swung over the railing and finally he could take a moment to inspect the deck and the odd bunch bustling on it. Grass, fresh and green like one could see it during spring in the Konoha forest, spread out before his feet. To his right was a tree with a swing, and right next to it a staircase that led to another level with a dome-shaped construction he could not make out entirely. On his left 2 other stairs led to the figurehead and a big and wide helm. Naruto probably would have continued to explore the sunny with his eyes, if it weren't for the loud outraged cry that made him nearly jump. The shout had come from a man in a suit and tie, with blonde hair like he himself had, but instead of spiking every which way it lay flat against his head, covering his left eye. He frowned, first Ino, then that creepy hand guy from Akatsuki, and now that man. Was this, cover one of your eyes style, some sort of a blonde thing? Was he supposed to do that too? Before he could indulge further into the mystery of fashion, he noticed the weird swirly eyebrow that reminded him of the whirlpool-like blazons sewed onto the back of the shinobi vests. But these details became less of a priority to him since he was more preoccupied by the way the man came marching towards him, a glint in his eyes Naruto knew from Iruka whenever he had been up to some particularly stupid idiocy. Sanji, for his part, was fuming. It was one thing for the boy, standing before him, to make off with their clothes. But he just had to pick his very best trousers, taking the matter a whole new level of annoying. Already when the brat did climb over the railing did he manage to take a closer look at the good piece of clothing, and he could literally feel a vein popping. The pants, which were far too long for the boy, were utterly ruined. Even when they had just fished him out of the water it had been painfully obvious that he was at least 1 head shorter than Luffy and Usopp, but had more muscles than the rubber head or the sharpshooter. So no surprise that the yellow shirt, which definitely belonged into Zoro's wardrobe, still fit him rather well. Granted, it hung from his shoulders as if he had slipped over a pillowcase, but at least it wasn't as tight as the black pants, which were just as grime-stained as the shirt. The trousers' legs had had to be rolled up several times by the boy, and going by the smudges, which Sanji knew he would never be able to wash out, even that measure had not prevented that he trip. Well, At least there was no vomit on it like on the Marimo's shirt, but that was only a poor consolation. "All right, you little," the cook growled out, stomping towards the boy and rolling up his sleeves. He would show him what it meant taking his things and worrying dear Robin Kwan. Indeed, had they not drawn by lot who was to run after the fugitive patient, then Robin would have most likely followed him. Lucky that the Marimo, Frankie and Brooke had run out of luck on this very evening. It seldom occurred that Naruto felt the sudden urge of running away from his enemy. The last time this happened he had been on his first mission with Team 7. He had sworn to himself to never run away again. He had upheld this oath ever since. But with this murderous aura oozing from the man, he considered if maybe he could make an exception. Just this once. Before Sanji could resort to violence, a bulky and hairy form jumped in his way, blocking Naruto's view and making the ninja retreat a few steps. It was Chopper. "Sanji, calm down, he might still be hurt," the reindeer admonished, turning his head in such a way that he could look at his patient from under the rim of his heat. The bandages he had applied on the broken arm and bruised shoulder seemingly had been taken off by the boy himself. The dark bluish and yellow-green hues indicated that the fractured bone was still about to heal. Chopper huffed at the thought of having to rearrange the bones once again, should the boy have done any more stupid stunts besides having left the infirmary. The bandages around his head had been left untouched and were stainless, save for some grains of sand. Either the blonde had not taken notice of it or deemed it unimportant. He would have to take a look at the wound anyway. Naruto was more than just a little perturbed by now. Slowly he moved backwards, back towards the ladder, which would lead him back to the forest and thus back to a more familiar environment. His plan did not work out though, because just when he was a hand's width away from the railings, Zoro had decided it was time to get the tiger on deck with one mighty swing. Forced to quickly choose for a way to escape, Naruto leapt to the side, away from the railing and towards the angry swirly brow. He only noticed his error in judgment when Zoro had already jumped onto the dead tiger's body. Zoro overlooked the scene with a bored expression. The boy is on his knees, probably because he had evaded the tiger and the love cook was being held back by Chopper. Apparently he couldn't else but start a fight. In the background was the rest of the crew with Luffy and Usopp trying to get a glimpse at everything that was going on. Nami and Robin were standing close to each other. Zoro was pretty sure the archaeologist was using her powers so as to keep track of everything. Both Frankie and Brooke were nowhere to be seen. Both were probably still away. He sent a scowl the cook's way when the latter tried to get him to explain to the brat that you didn't steal somebody's clothes and soiled them beyond recognition. Do it yourself. Good luck, trying to get him to talk though. He jerked his head in the direction of the boy, who was about to become very upset, doesn't understand a word and only talks gibberish. He stared at the boy again, but just like all the previous times he received no answers to his many questions. Naruto felt cramped and uncomfortable. He was used to this kind of situation where could not escape from the time when he had been just a small child and could not hide from the villagers' eyes. His only retreat had been his small flat, and that was God knows how many days' marches away. Hastily he looked around for a way to escape. It did not go unnoticed. Hey! Naruto nearly jumped out of his skin and slowly turned towards the green head, who was surveying him critically with one hand on his katanas. He did not really understand what it was, but this man's aura set him on edge. It was downright terrifying. Without further thought, he made the hand sign for Kagebushin no Jutsu. There was utter chaos as 6 Narutos now emerged on deck from clouds of smoke. This little trick caused great confusion and led to varied reactions from each member of the crew. While Zoro and Sanji had surprise written all over their faces, Usopp and Chopper freaked out and screamed something about an invasion. Nami's mouth hung open before managing to ask Robin, whose eyes were wide in astonishment, if maybe this was some sort of devil fruit power. Luffy, at first seemingly taken by surprise like the cook and swordsman, did not take long before proclaiming loudly just how cool this mystery trick was. By then all the Narutos had swarmed out and attracted the crew's attention. The real Naruto, however, was about to escape through the back door, so to say. This whole situation was far too crazy for his own good. He absolutely needed to get back to Konoha, or even better yet to the Land of Iron. He had no time for these kinds of antics. Once he was on the water and back on dry land, he might be able to shake them off and look for clues in order to get back home. Surely someone would be able to show him the way, and who knew, maybe wasn't as far away from home as he had assumed. Him currently being in a jungle did not have to mean anything. After all, until the time he had to take the Chunin exam, he would never even have imagined that he had a huge jungle lying right on his doorstep. He smiled confidently, convinced that nothing stood in his way anymore. In a single bound he leapt off the railing, and smacked into the side of the ship without warning. All of his shadow clones evaporated with a loud bang. OWWWWW. That hurt. He ed and rubbed his sore nose. It took his brain a few seconds to detect that something was amiss. He blinked several times before noticing that he was hanging upside down. The second thing he noticed was that his hand and feet held no contact whatsoever to the side of the ship, and last but not least that his left ankle felt like a couple of hands had wound around it like the tentacle of an octopus. He shuddered at the thought. Quickly he looked up, expecting to see some of those strange people to hold him. Instead of curious stares and some heads, he only saw arms which were growing from the wood. Arms, growing out of the wood. Naruto felt all the color being drained from his face. The scream he emitted would have raised even the shadowless shells of Moria's zombies. "What the hell?" he hollered, swinging from one side to the other like a pendulum. The only thing he achieved with his fidgeting though was that the shirt slipped down to his neck. He would have continued screaming for sure. By then he found the situation to be not only uncomfortable but downright grotesque, but a clear voice made him break off. "Relax, we do not mean any harm." He nearly choked as he jerkily turned his head in the direction of the voice. Bending over the railing above stood the tanned, dark-haired woman that had attracted his attention ever since he had woken up on the ship. Her arms were crossed, but that was less interesting than the fact that the bodiless arms were of the same color as her skin, or the fact that she had just spoken his language. He was absolutely sure of that. Robin smiled, for one to make a friendly impression and because she was glad that he seemed to have calmed down. It might not look like much, but even with so many arms it was a task to hold a flailing person. "We found you adrift on the sea. I apologize should my crewmates have caused you discomfort." Her calm laugh was strangely soothing and Naruto very much welcomed it, "but I assure you they are harmless." Naruto raised an eyebrow. "A guy with 3 swords that goes around killing giant tigers and threatens you when you try showing him the way back to his own ship, harmless." She answered him with a quiet chuckle, and Naruto to some extent managed to move the corners of his mouth up into a smile. After everything that had happened in those last months, it had become more and more of a challenge to smile, and his facial muscles made him feel that. Yet, there was something about this person that made her look unimposing and amiable. Naruto sensed that there was more to it though. He was positive she felt the same way. This feeling of familiarity he couldn't put into words. Robin looked at him again before giving her crew a small sign that everything was all right before she addressing the boy again. "I apologize that everything did not go as smoothly as we hoped it would. What would you say about coming back aboard? I may easily hold you like this for a while longer, but I am convinced you do not want your blood to go to your head." Well, she was not wrong with her assertion. Naruto could already feel his head was getting woozy, and admittedly he found it to be quite irritating. Usually it took more than a simple headstand to make him lightheaded. Maybe it was because he was so exhausted. What he had noticed though was that he felt not as good as he usually did after he had slept. That thought was disconcerting. "Fine," he sighed. He paused when he noticed a tiny detail in what she had said that made him question his own hearing again. "Wait, what do you mean by, easily hold you?" Before he could even finish the sentence he felt the hands around his ankle pull him up. He had to will himself to stay calm. So, this woman really was the one making the arms appear. No need to rack his brain though. He was sure he would find out soon anyway. He smirked internally as he thought how he could ask her to show him how to use that jutsu. He could always do with a set of additional hands, no matter if in form of individual limbs or shadow clones. He had barely finished his trail of thoughts when he found himself on the green grass again, surrounded by the people he had tried to evade for a second time on this day. He hastily pulled his shirt back over his navel as is considered right and proper. He seized them up, now that he wasn't intent on running away again, and was taken by surprise by what he saw. Except for the woman who could grow limbs with her jutsu, Naruto could make out only one other girl among the group of guys. She was standing right next to him, seizing him up skeptically, like a vendor who was trying to judge the worth of a good whose utility was yet to be determined. The most notable feature about her was her bright orange hair and a blue tattoo on her shoulder, visible because of the blank top she was sporting. Naruto was not exactly what one would call innocence personified when it came to watching and spying on women, even in the bathhouses, yet the skirt she was wearing was so short that he felt himself blush involuntarily. He let his gaze wander to the next person. Two boys he had not noticed until now squeezed next to her, the girl protesting loudly, although he still did not understand everything, kneeling down in front of him and merrily babbling away, probably not getting that he would not be able to respond to it. Both were tan, the long-nosed guy more than the one with the straw hat, but both had dark eyes. The long nose was wearing a bandana which kept his curly hair in check, and a gadget with round dark glasses sitting on top of it all. The green dungarees seemed to have seen better days already with the many stains and rattled knees that adorned it. It was obvious the working pants were being used on a daily basis. The other boy was also wearing a green, but his sleeveless vest was of a lighter shade than the brown-green of the dungarees. It was kind of funny that the color matched the hair of the swordsman perfectly. Speaking of him, he and the strange blonde were standing offside in the back and were arguing heatedly, but not as loudly as one might have expected. Another thing that got his interest was the armband with glass. Also, he was the only one running around in sandals. Naruto squinted when it became apparent that someone was missing. Where was the huge hairy guy who had defended him? Is everything all right? For the umpteenth time this evening he let his head snap around. The dark-haired woman had kneeled down to his level. He'd only noticed now that he had sat down. He sprang to his feet immediately, startling them. She in turn got up wordlessly and asked again after he had dusted down the black pants front and back. It did not do anything about its poor condition though. He sent a small smile her but winced when he felt his cheek sting. Seems like his collision with the wood had been a lot harder than he had thought. Nah, no worries. Takes a lot more to make the future Hokage sweat. He forced another smile. Sorry about the clothes, but I'm in a rush. I have to go or it'll be too late. Everyone stared at him dumbfounded. It was hardly surprising. None of them had ever heard a language as convoluted and complicated as the one the boy delivered. Everyone's attention was on Robin, being the only one seemingly able to communicate with the stranger. Robin looked him up and down thoughtfully. She had a feeling that she had already heard of some of the things he had said a long time ago. She just couldn't remember where and in what connection. She subtly shook her head. This was not the time to let her thoughts stray. We are glad to know you are feeling better. Our doctor was worried, especially after your little escape. Naruto tried smiling again while scratching the back of his head, giving him the appearance of a schoolboy getting caught at playing a bad prank. Again he winced when his cheek made itself noticed. Okay, that sure was going to be a bruise. We found you on the open sea unconscious. What? His eyes widened comically at this. He had been found on the sea. Was that even possible? He desperately racked his brain, hoping he might remember his last conversation with Kakashi and Yamato. He vaguely remembered that the country of iron was close to the sea and that somewhere beyond it lay Temujin's homeland. His brow furrowed, but wasn't the summit supposed to be far away from the coast when they had headed there? Just what had happened? Why couldn't he remember a thing? Exasperated, he tore at his hair. Robin took note of the expression of helplessness and confusion crossing his features. Hoping to quench his rising panic, she decided to continue talking. A distraction might just be what he needed before he started getting worked up over whatever was causing him distress. You are currently on the ship of the Straw Hat Pirates. My name is Nico Robin and I am an archaeologist. This is Nami, our navigator. The two boys are Usopp, our marksman, and Luffy, our captain. Our swordsman, Zoro, you've already met. The blonde is our chef, Sanji. And this, she said while turning around and picking something up from the deck behind her, as our doctor, Chopper. In her arms she held a flailing little creature. The small reindeer was squirming nervously, but Robin did not let go and just smiled down sweetly at him before facing the boy again, who was eyeing the crew intently. His face spoke volumes. That, he said, as he stared at Chopper doubtfully, is a stag with a hat. He was pretty sure that he had gotten the animal right. Shikamaru once had taken him, Choji and Kiba to a clearing where a whole herd of them had been grazing. That had been years ago. Surely the woman was just pulling his leg. She had, after all, claimed that the guy with the straw hat, who couldn't be 2 years older than him, was the captain of this ship. Instead of being upset by what he had said, she seemed pleased and whispered something into the animal's ear he couldn't understand. The animal's eyes widened before it uttered sounds he wouldn't have thought him capable of doing. Robin laughed quietly and nodded. He says he is happy that he has not been mistaken for a raccoon for once. But he is not a stag but a reindeer. Naruto was inclined to write her and all the rest of them off as crazy until he remembered Fukusaku, Gamabunta and Katsuyu. If the reindeer was a summon, then it was perfectly possible that he could indeed speak. But still, a small reindeer with a pink top hat and blue nose was peculiar. Chopper for his part also was looking at Naruto in interest for a moment before turning back to Robin, asking in astonishment, why isn't he afraid? The archaeologist was taken aback by the question when it dawned on the little doctor was getting at. Up until now people tended to be completely rattled when they realized that Chopper possessed human qualities. The lack of reaction from the boy was unusual and confusing for the reindeer. Robin asked the boy directly, latter simply shrugging. Well, I did find it kind of strange, but then I remembered that summons usually do talk. He scratched his head again and looked around. Everyone was looking at him, making uncomfortable like earlier. Anyway, I really need to go back home ASAP. You know by any chance where this is exactly? I do not, but our navigator will for sure be able to tell you. Robin inquired about their whereabouts. Nami held her chin, deep in thought. I found out that this island is uninhabited and covered by a dense tropical forest. There's also a volcano. She pointed towards a hill that looked pretty unspectacular from afar. Apart from that, nothing is known about this island. Out of all the routes that exist on the Grand Line, ours is the only one that leads to it. Where does the fellow want to go? Robin directed the question towards the boy. You haven't told us your name yet. I didn't. He himself did not seem to have noticed. I'm Naruto Uzumaki. He announced proudly, crossing his arms. That picture was soon broken by his own anxiousness, his roaming eyes making it all too obvious. He seemed to be considering something. I'm in a hurry, so, do any of you know the way to the Land of Iron? For a moment Robin furrowed her brow. Nami was and would remain unequaled in cartographies and knowledge about islands, but Robin also had accumulated a great amount of input about all kinds of islands on the Four Blues and the Grand Line, mostly during her childhood and through her favorite pastime. Never in her life had she heard of the Land of Iron. Nami, are you familiar with an island going by the designation, Land of Iron? Our guest says he has to go there as soon as possible. The navigator stared at her wryly while the boys threw confused looks each other's ways. The ginger shook her head. I've never heard of such an island. How about asking him where he's from, Robin? Robin did just that. Well, from Konoha obviously. Naruto retorted, his eyebrows drawing together incredulously as though it was expected to be common knowledge. He also put a finger on his headband, currently hanging around his neck. He had been relieved when he had found it, lying openly in the strange room with the many hanging cases. Again Robin inquired Nami for information, though her efforts were not rewarded. By then Naruto had completely run out of patience. Angrily he stomped his foot on the deck, immediately making Zoro and Sanji go into a fighting stance and making the girls as well as Usopp and Chopper jump. Luffy's face remained neutral as he watched the stranger with his big eyes. Zoro may have been the only one to notice, but Luffy's expression had continuously changed the more and the longer the strange boy kept talking. He was pretty sure that inside those brown eyes he caught something like recognition. But with Luffy it was difficult to tell. His attention soon was back on the boy in front of him. Naruto's blue eyes flashed dangerously in the light of the lamps. I don't have time for this, the young ninja roared, his fists clenched. His whole body seemed to shudder from sheer tension. I have to get to the cage summit. I can't waste any more time like this. He breathed heavily after his sudden outburst, and Chopper feared that he might have worsened his condition, but had he known him better he would have known that this was nothing compared to what he had been through before. Robin, unlike the rest of the crew, remained composed. She at least had the advantage of understanding what the boy was getting so upset about. The corners of her mouth twitched slightly upwards when her gaze landed on her captain. He watched the exchange with relative calmness, not making a move like Zoro or Sanji. She was not entirely certain if he had enough faith in her to let him know should things go awry, or if it was his instinct telling him how to react as it did so often. She guessed it might be a bit both. "I am really sorry," she replied, earning her a nasty look from the ninja, one Sanji directed back at him with equal intensity. No man was allowed to treat Robin Kwan this way. Robin ignored this silent and one-sided exchange in favor of talking. "Could you at least tell us from which ocean you come?" The boy looked at her as though she had asked him to please go and jump into the sea. "There's more than one ocean." He seemed at a loss, the way he stared at her. He probably hoped that she would tell him that this was all some kind of a bad joke and that he was already at his destination. Robin got a queasy feeling when she realized that he probably wasn't going like her answer. "There are 5 oceans in total. The East Blue, the North Blue, the South Blue, the West Blue and the Grand Line. Currently our ship set anchor at one of the many small islands on the Grand Line. The only known continent is the Red Line, a gigantic mountain range, separating all the oceans from each other." For an indefinite amount of time the Sunny was completely silent. All crew members were staring at Robin with wide eyes. They may not have understood what this was all about, but they had undoubtedly heard the names of the blues and the only continent in between all the gibberish. The atmosphere was broken at last by heavy breathing. The eyes of the straw hats rested on the boy, whose hat was tilted forward, making his hair shadow his eyes. He took another breath, as if he could not get enough oxygen inside his lungs, before releasing it quietly. Luffy and Zoro were the first ones to feel the aura around the boy changing. A quick glance between captain and swordsman was enough for them to assess the situation. Finally the boy raised his head, but his wrathful features left all except Robin frowning deeply. Something in those eyes flared up with such malice it sent shivers up and down the more timid members' spines like Nami and Usopp. "Are you shitting me?" The cry was so loud that Chopper had to cover his ears. He knew it took far more to rupture one's eardrums, but he swore just a bit more and his ears would start bleeding. Inconspicuously he took something out of his hat. In that time the boy had taken a stance for an offensive. He gave them a fierce look. It didn't matter anymore just how much the swordsman had intimidated him previously, he had forgotten. What this woman was trying to feed him was absolute bullshit. There was only one ocean and one continent. "You tell me right now where I am or I'll beat the answer out of you." Zoro would have snorted in disdain, had he understood, and quietly Robin was thankful it did not come to this exchange. Fighting was not the solution to this problem. When she recognized the object in Chopper's hoof she sent a meaningful look the doctor's way and he nodded in a barely perceptible way. Before anyone could even anticipate it, arms started growing at the ninja's feet and 4 slender arms on his body, coiling themselves around him in such a fashion he couldn't move anymore. Surprised and terrified, Naruto lost his balance and fell backwards. His skull felt like it wanted to split in two as the back of his head collided with the wood. He ed, closing his eyes in an attempt to make the pain go away faster. Suddenly he felt a prick somewhere around his neck. Instantly his eyes flew open just in time to see the small reindeer take a shot away from the offended area. He sent him such a venomous glare that the little doctor hid behind one of Zoro's legs, watching him from a safe distance. When his body started feeling strangely heavy, he was overcome by utter dread. He did not want to be at their mercy. With the last of his strength he tried to free himself, bending his back so far that he could feel how his spine cried out in protest. It was no use, the arms holding him in place had an iron-tight grip on him. His wild, alarmed eyes found the archaeologists and silently she communicated to him that she was sorry it had come down to this. Seconds later darkness began creeping into his field of vision and his body no longer obeyed him. The last thing he noticed before his consciousness floated into the dark abyss were the agitated, muffled voices of the strangers. "It's such a shame I wasn't on the ship to see the young man while he was awake, although I do not have eyes to see with." "Yo-ho-ho-ho. I agree with you, bro. Sure had to be exciting." Nami sighed dramatically, whereas she slumped down and did not even bother to explain to her crewmates, who had just returned a while ago, that the whole situation was not as funny as they believed it to be. It was quieter than usually in the kitchen, even though Luffy and Usopp were having a lively conversation with Robin about their mysterious passenger. One could practically feel how everyone was waiting eagerly for their youngest crew member to come through the door and tell them how the boy was doing. They also wanted to wait for him so they could discuss their next steps. His violent outbreak had shaken them. After all, he had been ranting about some quite unbelievable stuff from what Robin had translated for them. One big ocean and one big continent, which wasn't a gigantic red wall of rock of many miles in height. To them it sounded like one of Usopp's less well-told fabrications. Robin, Nami interrupted, turning toward the triumvirate, who had been discussing the possibility of the boy having eaten a fruit similar to the archaeologists. So, the boy. Naruto. Robin corrected her and Nami nodded. So do you think this Naruto guy has been pulling our legs? Robin's expression became thoughtful. She knew what Nami was talking about, for the very same thought had crossed her mind several times this evening. All of the crew's attention remained on her, even Sanji's, who was currently standing at the stove and preparing a variety of warm drinks for everyone. That is difficult to answer. It is possible he lied to you, though we lack a plausible motif. Nami nodded, while the men were waiting for further explanation. What we should not forget is that by Chopper's diagnosis he received a hit to his head. It might very well be that he is disoriented and, as it seems, confused because of it. A unified grunt from the male party showed that everyone was entirely satisfied with this theory. Luffy grinned broadly. Shishishi, I like him. I want him in the crew. The punch was to be expected and its loudness not to be scoffed at. Oh no, you don't, you idiot. Just what's it with you and inviting strangers? Nami raged, her fist still fuming even after Luffy managed to get up again, the right side of his face unrecognizable because of a huge bump. But Nami, he wailed as if the very same short-tempered woman had not been the cause of his cranial trauma. He's got awesome powers. And just what do you think Heel will do with those once he wakes up? Usopp interjected, frowning deeply. By now many scenarios had played in front of the inner eye of the king of snipers and negatives, none of which he liked. For once I agree with him. Sanji piped up from the other side of the room, all the while not taking his eyes off the steaming contents of the pots. Luffy's eager rubber fingers had gotten too close to them for comfort more than once already. Admittedly, Robin might be right, but what if he's part of the Marine? If he can repeat his little trick, as Luffy put, as many times as he wants, he could become dangerous to us. The lack of praise and worshipping of one of his lovely ladies showed them just how seriously the cook was taking this issue. Bollocks! Muttered Zoro, who was leaning back in his chair. A nasty grin flashed over his lips. You're just scared that a shrimp like that could beat you. Lightning fast, Sanji turned around, his only visible eye glistening fiercely. You little. Yet before he had the time to come back at the man with a vicious remark, he was interrupted by him. Zoro's expression was stern now that he had had his fun with the cook, as it is he is wounded and harmless. He seemed to ponder something before he went on. He probably isn't even that strong. Went all wide-eyed when I lifted that tiger. Pshaw, tiger. Sanji scoffed, scarcely audible, but Zoro's fine-tuned ears still caught it, and I'm still saying that the dinosaur from back then was bigger. What was that? Zoro hissed, and soon both men were continuing the argument they had started on deck earlier. By now it became such a routine thing that the rest of the crew simply did not pay attention to their squabbles anymore. Well, if it's Zoro saying it, said Usopp, heaving a sigh of relief. Zoro may have problems distinguishing left and right, but when it came to assessing the strength of an enemy he trusted him wholeheartedly. Zoro himself was some freaky monster that could sense strength for miles around, it seemed. When her turned towards Luffy though, he was taken aback by seeing his captain with his arms folded, peering at Zoro. It was rare to see the rubber man this serious. Robin appeared to be thinking along his lines. Is something the matter, Sencho? Luffy did not answer and addressed Zoro instead. Hey Zoro, you didn't feel it? The swordsman, currently about to keep a black polished leather shoe out of his face, turned his head towards his captain, one eyebrow raised quizzically. What are you talking about? Nami interposed, letting her gaze flicker between the two men. Captain and swordsman stared at each other for a few seconds, and everyone noted with some frustration that this was one of their silent conversations. How they pulled it off none of them had found out yet. The only possible explanation they could come up with was that the monsters simply were in tune with each other. While Luffy's brown orbs remained unchangingly pervasive, Zoro's green ones began to widen in awareness. He knew what Luffy was talking about. Of course he had felt that strange pressure emanating from the boy when he had gotten angry. It was comparable to the aura he, his captain and even the love cook emitted when they were out for a fight. Still, he couldn't else but question the strength of the boy. Not that anyone could seriously blame him for that. A boy who in his presence had only managed to retch and otherwise throw nervous glances his ways as though he was afraid to get eaten was not what he would classify as fine and brave man. Damn, even Usopp was more of a brave warrior than that teenager. He conveyed all of this to his captain, but to his surprise Luffy did not budge. He paused for a moment. What had Luffy felt that escaped Zoro and had impressed the rubber man enough so as not to be swayed by his oldest friend? His brow furrowed as he remembered Luffy's expression from earlier. Could there be more than just strength involved? Frankie, just like everyone else, felt somewhat left out in this silence. Did we miss out on anything else? Robin opened her mouth to reply so as to spare him and the musician any more confusion just as Chopper came through the door, his fluffy fur rumpled and head hanging in exhaustion. I freshly bandaged him and he's sleeping for now, but I can't say for how long, he told him, entirely flopping down on one of the swivel chairs. He's lucky he hasn't injured himself further. The wounds he had were already bad enough. Both women of the crew nodded their heads in understanding. They had helped him out a lot with his nursing, so they both had seen the damage for themselves. According to your evaluation, they boy would have needed another few days of rest before awakening, Robin said, repeating the diagnosis the little reindeer after the stranger had awoken after his first night on the Sunny. Chopper affirmed it with a nod. Sanji chose that very moment to deposit a huge tray on the table, laden with steaming cups, none of which remained there longer than a few seconds. The group allowed themselves a few tentative sips until Sanji had stowed away the tray and sat himself in a vacant chair, his own cup already awaiting him. So, he's sleeping again. The cook summarized and produced a cigarette and a match from his pocket. Now that he was done with making the drinks, he could allow himself a drag of his nicotine without having to fear he might accidentally get ash into one of his creations. And we can't be too sure about when he will wake up and what he will do then. Chopper, who had not been present at their initial debate, paused in his drinking and blinked up at the cook quizzically. What do you mean? Patient as she was, Robin told him about their earlier conversation. Chopper's big eyes were looking at the floorboards in a pensive fashion. I do not think his head injury compromised his memories or his judgment, he said with certainty, looking up again. His expression was firm. It's true that he received a hit to his head, but the type of injury indicates the blow was neither powerful nor precise enough to leave permanent damage. This evaluation did not reassure anyone, instead it prompted more questions. So we are dealing with a potentially aggressive nutcase, Nami complained, letting her head rest on the table and combing through her hair nervously. She was in no mood and even less possessed the nerves to concern herself with someone like that. The crew was already a handful, thank you very much. Before anyone could have anticipated it, their captain piped up again. What do you think of him, Robin? Taken aback by his sudden interest in her opinion, Robin's went a little wide, and as she gazed at her captain, whose eyes remained determined, revealing to her just how serious he was being. It was unusual for him to in a way ask for the crew's consent. He also hadn't asked anyone if they were fine with Brooke joining, but it seemed as if it dawned on him that only someone who did understand the boy could pass proper judgment. Robin thought about it for a bit and no one interrupted her train of thoughts. The rest of the crew was at least as eager to hear the verdict as their captain. Robin for her part went through a list of facts. She did that often so as to keep track with everything, and when she was investigating ruins, it helped her in her analyses, and even if she had wanted to drop that habit there was no way she ever could. Professor Clover himself had rammed into her. First point. Looks inconspicuous. The symbol on his headband the only clue to his alleged citizenship. Point 2. Place of discovery. In the middle of the sea, many days away from civilization and any islands. Unclear if shipwrecked or not, the latter improbable because of finding place. Point 3. Symbols and inscriptions. She smiled a little to herself. There might not be any inscriptions to read from the boy, but the language he spoke was the one spoken around the time of the Void Century. Point 4. Content. Told them about a world with only one ocean and continent. Master of a supposedly extinct language. Mentioned nations and civilizations neither she nor Nami ever heard about. Had to go to a meeting of shadows. If she had not misunderstood the meaning of the word, but Robin had a hunch that it did have nothing to do with real shadows, rather it was an abstract term used for one person or more. Like with Baroque works. Point 5. Conspicuous traits. Is able to generate copies of himself, seemingly with a movement of the hand just like her. Could be the power of a devil fruit. Yet, contradicting with the fact that he tried to flee from the side of the ship which was facing the sea. Lack of fear towards Chopper's human qualities. Even named a specific term for it. Managed to abscond before anyone noticed. Became angry when he was told he was not in his supposed surroundings. Conclusion. I do not think that our guest is part of the Marine. As if spellbound, their eyes did not leave her face as Robin stated her opinion after some thinking time. Many eyebrows shot up. Her small smile became even wider as she noticed how Luffy began fidgeting on the chair beside her impatiently. Nothing could possibly make his plan fail. Well, except maybe the boy's own opinion on that matter. If his plan had been to capture us all, he would have been able to attack at any moment, like at night when there is only one of us keeping watch. If it had been to infiltrate us, he would not have gone through the trouble of fleeing from us just so he could be caught and brought back. I am sorry, Chopper, but we have to even consider the possibility that he was already mentally confused even before we found him. I do think we will be able to say it for certain once we had enough time to talk to him. Sanji's expression mirrored the distress he was feeling inside. He was reluctant to let his Robin Kwan be close to the ribald fishcake, while the small doctor agreed, not in the slightest offended by Robin's words. It was true he had nothing in his hooves to find if the stranger wasn't mentally defective. She might even be right with her assumption. The boy might have been unstable before being hit on the head. But his animalic instincts were telling him it wasn't the case. Also, he did like the boy despite what had happened earlier this evening. The boy might have picked the wrong species, but at least he had not been mistaken for a raccoon. The discussion did not seem to particularly reassure Nami, and so she stuck with wallowing in her misery and self-pity. Usopp patted her on the shoulder sympathetically, anxious to make her see the good in the situation and the soon-to-be, unwanted recruitment. As it was, Nami was inconsolable. Frankie and Brook turned to their captain, who seemed to be about to storm into the infirmary, the patient still being out cold being of no concern. They wanted to find out more about the young man, who was occupying Luffy's mind, and promptly started a conversation with him. Zoro's expression barely changed, his furrowed brow leaving no doubt that he would have no second thoughts about his first evaluation unless proven otherwise. Sanji took a drag of his cigarette before stubbing it out in an ashtray on the table and leaning back in his chair a little. Since we've resolved that issue, we better think about how we're going to fill the pantry, he said, looking at everybody around. Luffy, who had been showing with his arms just how many clones the stranger had made appear, blinked at him confusedly. Why? A vein protruded on the cook's and navigator's temple. Because you idiot broke the damned lock and ate everything we had. Both screamed, pointing at a twisted scrap of metal on the fridge's handle. That it had once been a combination lock no one would ever have been able to tell. The rubber man had taken advantage of the commotion caused by the boy's disappearance and had emptied the fridge, stuffing himself to his heart's content. The shipwright had been just as furious as the others when he noticed what had happened, but now he saw the incident as some sort of personal challenge. Next time the lock would be able to withstand his captain's inhuman strength. Sanji was just glad he had still managed to snatch the lunch boxes away from Luffy, even if only just. The quickly repeated apology sounded anything but sincere, the reason why no one was surprised when both Nami and Sanji threw themselves at the rubber boy to teach him another lesson. Didn't I bring the tiger with me earlier? Zoro asked, irritated, throwing an evil eye his rival's way. Sanji let up on Luffy and left him to a hopping mad Nami. That thing may be huge, but it won't be enough. That glutton here, his thumb pointed at the tangle of limbs behind him, will have eaten that within the next day, and we don't only need meat. The shithead practically swallowed everything we had. A whiny voice from behind him interrupted the cook, but I was hungry. You're always hungry, so shut it. And he was back at helping Nami. Frankie grinned broadly, pushing his sunglasses out of his eyes. Sounds like we will have to explore the island again tomorrow. Brook calmly took another sip of his tea. Yo-ho-ho-ho. I spotted a tree with lots of fruits. I could take you there if you like. Sanji nodded at that. That would be great. It probably would be better if I took a look at them first. Would be a pity if we spent our time picking fruit and then finding out it isn't edible or worse poisonous. Usopp shuddered for reasons only Sanji could understand. Poisonous food was a taboo subject for the sniper, let alone mushrooms. Nami, who had inflicted several bumps and bruises on Luffy, now stood up, propping her hands on the wooden table, stern gaze clearly visible for everyone. So, Sanji and Brook will already be going. Usopp, would you accompany them? She asked, turning towards the sniper. He complied. With Sanji and Brook he was on the safe side since both still had some common sense. Poor Frankie. Good. She looked at Zoro, who seemed about ready to doze off. You will be looking for other beasts like that tiger. You did pretty well finding your way back on your own. Never thought I'd tell you something like this ever. To her and everyone else's surprise, the swordsman did not seem overly happy about that statement. His eyes suspiciously wandered to the far end of the room, his mouth being drawn into a thin line. Nami could practically feel her temples being in dire need of a pair of two hands massaging them. Oh please, don't you tell me that the boy lead you back. Zoro's eyes became slits as he sent her a hostile glare. The guy was just lucky enough to have seen the lights from the sunny. I would have found the way back on my own. While Luffy roared in laughter and Robin discreetly smiled into her hand, the rest of the crew gave into the temptation of face-palming. No matter how one looked at it, they would never be allowed to let Zoro go somewhere without tying him to a leash. Forget I said anything. The navigator replied, exasperated, and went to address the one person that had cost her more nerves than all the crew's antics together. Luffy, you'll accompany him, and if I find out that any of our potential provisions end up in your stomach, I'll bloody murder you. The air around her seethed and even Luffy couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. Even the future king of the pirates knew it was wiser not to defy a livid Nami. Instead he grinned, bumps and bruises unable to take away its radiance. All right, Nami. She made an angered noise but left it at that. Nami appointed rather than asking Frankie to go with the two sillies for their own safety. She would be with the other group. Before she could make plans for the last two members of the crew piped up, beating her to it. I'll stay to keep an eye on the boy, announced Chopper, thus making questions unnecessary. She smiled at the reindeer and her eyes focused on Robin. The archaeologist let one of her fingers slide daintily over the rim of her cup, giving her friend a calm smile. I will be joining Chopper and give him a hand or two. It is probably better this way. It does seem as though Naruto does not speak any other language, and it would be a relief to have someone around who can communicate with him. There were no objections concerning that matter, but it did bring up a question that had bothered most people in this room all evening long. Robin, just what kind of language does he speak? It was quiet for a while and Robin paused before she looked up again, her eyes shining strong and firm. A language from the time of the lost century, the language of the poneglyph, she announced in the tense silence. The air around him was stale with destruction and death. Gray buildings rose up into the white and black sky, their walls collapsed, the only thing keeping them upright being their beams and main pillars, creaking under the pressure of their encumbrances. The wind swept over this plain, blowing up dust and small debris, whipping the dirt at his face and making him raise his hands to protect his face. In the distance he heard the crumbling and rumbling of a house caving in, but he couldn't see it from where he stood. Naruto recognized the signs on the disintegrated walls instantly. He was in Konoha. He turned on the spot, his gaze roaming over the chaos in his desperate search for something. What he was looking for he did not know exactly, but he was sure that it was important, that if he did not find it very soon it would be too late and out of reach. Unsteadily he took one step after another, following the path, which wasn't yet covered in too much rubble from the remains of the houses he had passed daily as a child. Shards of glass scrunched under the soles of his sandals and a pale cloth flapped in the wind, which was neither warm nor cold. A dripping sound aroused his attention and he turned his back around, expecting to see the rest of the demolished shopping street. Contrary to expectations, he was greeted by vague darkness. He wanted to go back but an invisible force did not allow him to. Shortly after he gave up on his endeavors and set his gaze forward once again. But the street had disappeared. In its stead there was a hollow tree together with a forest with no foliage and no life. Instead of a rough bark there were only smooth, unblemished white sheets of paper, for layer stabilizing the construct. He had barely processed what he was seeing when the papers split, making an entrance just big enough for one person to pass through. Naruto's sharp eyes could not locate anything in that dense darkness. As if by an invisible hand he was steered towards it, although something inside him jibed. Suddenly he had feeling he needed to run away, as far away as possible and never turn back. But his body was not under his control anymore. That very thought terrified him. He strode through the arch and it instantly sealed behind him. Woozy light suffused its interior of the tree but he could not find its source. He still was all alone. He wondered why he was expecting someone else to be here. All of a sudden a shape with a long coat emerged from the blackness and Naruto recognized that face, pierced with black studs. Pain, he breathed but the name sounded wrong in his own ears. He did not know why nor could he remember why felt this way. The cycle of hatred has yet to be broken. The voice was still the same but Naruto now realized why the name felt so wrong. He blinked. The vibrant hair and piercings were gone but bleached red hair and sunken in cheeks now replaced them. Nagato's Rinnegan gleamed dangerously in their gray surroundings. The cycle of hatred has yet to be broken, repeated the man like a broken record. Naruto swallowed. His mouth was as dry as the Suna desert. I told you I would find a way, he responded coldly. His hands were balling into fists, while his jaw tensed up. Nagato had no right to demand an account from him, but before I take care of that I have to keep the Raikage from killing Sasuke. His gaze had gone to the ground swiftly and when he looked up Nagato had receded a few steps. He hadn't even noticed the other move. He probably hadn't either. Everything seemed to make sense even though it should not. There is no time left, Nagato said dispassionately, his eyes staring at Naruto without emotion. He unexpectedly raised his arm, pointing to a spot behind Naruto. Unsuspecting, he turned around. On the snow-covered ground lay bodies. The bodies of those, whose chakra had flickered out when he arrived at Konoha or who had been wounded. Kakashi, Hinata, Shizune and other blurred outlines of people seemed to stretch on towards the horizon, their hands folded over their chests and faces relaxed as though they were merely sleeping. He could feel no life coming from them. Naruto felt his stomach turn when he spotted the long white hair of his old sensei. And amidst this giant laying out, a single person was kneeling and crying over the bloodied form of a human he had promised to bring back home at all costs. The red color stood out against the hueless ground. The dripping noise from before even drowned out his shrill cry. Sakura. He crashed down onto the wooden floor with a startling amount of force, tangled in sheets that constricted him the more he struggled. Naruto was panting heavily. The nightmare was clear as a shard of glass. It wasn't the first he has had since the invasion was over. Naruto forced himself to take deep breaths before he began to free himself from his prison made of cloth. It took more time than he would have liked and took more effort than he had anticipated but his stomach felt funny and was doing somersaults as soon as he tried moving. Disgruntled, he also noticed how dry his mouth was. There's nothing like a morning with a dry mouth and queasiness. Grumbling he finally managed to sit upright in bed, wiping at his sore face with a hand so as to lessen the drumming inside his head. He probably would have to ask for Sakura's aid, hopefully it would not result in the same painful dismissal he had gotten when he had asked with no apparent injury. He felt a stabbing pain as the nightmare suddenly came to mind. The image of his sobbing crush and his dead friend were burned into his mind, making him restless and leaving him with a feeling of helplessness he had only felt after he found out about Jiraiya's death. He shook his head, admonishing himself for thinking too much about it. He was already doing all he could to solve this problem. Still, the menacing words had been unsettling. Even though they came from a shadow in a dream, there still rung truth in them. Madara was on the move and he was running out of time. With a resolute, little jump Naruto got off his bed, when he noticed that this wasn't his bed at all. This wasn't even his room. In a far more sinister part of his mind a small voice reminded him that his apartment had been destroyed along with many others during Nagato's invasion to retrieve him. In a flash he remembered events from yesterday, which he had taken for a very vivid dream, his escape from this very room and the ship, how had been found by that strange, aggressive and way too strong guy with funny hair color, how he had been dragged back to the ship, how that peculiar woman prevented him from escaping with her jutsu, how they'd had a conversation. The nausea got a little worse, but it was nowhere near as bad as yesterday in the forest, where he had emptied his stomach. That at least was a small improvement. He indecisively stared at the closed door, leading to room that probably was some sort of dining room. There had been a huge table and many chairs in there. He could even remember his tantrum now, and it made him blush in utter shame. These people had been nice enough to help him, while they had no obligation to do so, and he had behaved like an ungrateful jerk. He was well aware of the fact that Sakura wouldn't be the only one disappointed in his actions. He quietly made his way to the door, hand already outstretched to push down on the handle, when somebody on the other side of it beat him to it. The wooden door swung open to the other room, and inside the doorframe appeared the face of the dark-haired woman. Both looked at each other for a moment, both startled, before Robin, he was sure that it was the name she had given him yesterday, offered him a smile, which the ninja found he deserved. At least not after having branded her and her crew as liars. "Good morning," she greeted, and only did he notice the tray with a pot filled with tea and 2 matching cups. As if she hadn't been standing there rooted on the spot a moment ago, she entered the small room and put her load on the desk. Diligently she put the cups next to each other and poured some of the tea into them. The beverage gave off a pleasantly spicy and sweet smell. Our cook was sure that a freshly brewed ginger tea would do you some good. Malaise is a common side effect of tranquilizers, she went on explaining, while taking a seat in the only chair in the room, teacup casually held in one hand. Naruto stood there abashed, unable to come up with any sort of reply. In all honesty, her casual way of addressing him was throwing him for a loop. The only thing he managed to do was an intuitive nod. It took him a few more seconds to realize she had slipped a warm cup of tea in his hand too. Robin seemed rather amused about his stunned state. Thanks," he mumbled, taking a tentative sip. It tasted pretty good. For someone who usually did not drink tea because it often was too bitter, that had to say something. He could feel its warmth spreading inside him, and indeed did his stomach no longer try to do flips. It was a nice feeling which promptly made a smile appear on his face. Robin was watching him, and even though it was not as insistently or intrusive as he was used to, it was still awkward. He felt like some exhibit, although he still had to determine what could be so interesting about him. The deer from yesterday definitely had more to offer. Naruto had not taken notice of how his face betrayed his every thought while lost in thought. The archaeologist found it as insightful as it was fascinating. The boy had a very expressive face and was just like most of her fellow crew members, unable to conceal his feelings. It would be interesting to see if he was as bad at lying as Luffy. In the meantime, the ninja had been so embarrassed he let his eyes trail everywhere but to Robin, since he had no clue how to approach her without wishing the ground would please open up and swallow him whole. He noted that he was back into clothes he had worn upon his first awakening, a white shirt and a pair of light blue boxers. His face took on a very intense shade of beet red, and Robin couldn't help the small giggle escaping her. "The clothes you snatched away are currently being washed. I do not think I need to tell you that our swordsman and cook were somewhat saddened by their condition." She refrained from mentioning that his own set of clothes had also been ruined beyond repair. His mouth set into a thin, pale line while his blue eyes darted to a corner of the infirmary. Were she psychic, she would have known he was asking himself just how they wanted to get some of the stains out. But since she could not hear them, Robin attempted to keep the bit of conversation they had going. She wanted to shatter the ice and the tenseness lying in the air, even if she had to use rather unfair means to achieve her goal. "Currently the crew is away to get provisions," she explained, drinking some of her tea. Just like Naruto, she found Sanji's newest creation praiseworthy. It was true the archaeologist of the Straw Hats preferred coffee, but the mix of ginger with mint and cardamom was soothing and relaxing. Maybe that was the reason why he had given her this special blend, knowing who she would be dealing with later. Naruto, who was still standing in the middle of the room, paused while drinking. Taking the cup from his lips, he focused a bit of chakra in his ears, and indeed the racket he had initially associated with the crew was not present. It eerily quiet except for hooves. The ninja questioned, doubtful expression turning to Robin. Robin nodded, hiding her astonishment about the boy's bat-like hearing. Chopper was, as far as she knew, in the boy's cabin and thus on the other side of Sunny. Yes, our doctor stayed so he could take care of you. At first it seemed as though he had no idea what she was talking about, making her question just how much he remembered from yesterday until she saw his eyes widen. Now it was clear he remembered everything, he simply had needed a little help. That deer, reindeer. Robin corrected and Naruto acknowledged it. So that, reindeer really is your doctor, for him that possibility seemed hardly likely. Robin nodded in understanding and set her cup aside on the desk. He ate the human fruit and therefore is able to speak and carry out human activities. Furthermore, he has been trained by a very skilled physician. Chopper had mentioned his home and Dr. Kurha to her more than once. Surely, he will want to ask you some questions once he returns. The sound of a door clicking shut interrupted her and her smile widened a little. That would be him. Naruto seemingly wanted to ask her about something but differently from her he was distracted by the sudden noise and before he could return to his question of what a human fruit was, the door swung open and a cheerful reindeer emerged from the kitchen. Oh Robin, what's going? The small doctor started asking, since he had not been expecting her to be here. Just a few minutes ago she had still been in the library, doing research. He screeched as he saw the boy, standing quite awake and upright in his small room. Out of reflex Chopper hid behind the door, peeping out behind it as though fearing he could be found out. Naruto looked taken aback while Robin was very much amused. She may be used to Chopper reacting uneasily to strangers but it was always droll to see the small reindeer this flustered. Do not worry, Chopper, she said reassuringly and the reindeer set his saucer eyes his friend, I simply brought Naruto some tea. At the mention of his name the blonde cast a questioning look at her. Chopper's eyes returned to the boy, who seemed to count on Robin just as much as he did in this situation. He gulped as he thought back of yesterday evening. Him eating his devil fruit had not impaired his animalic instincts in the slightest and what he had felt yesterday, a powerful and wild aura pouring out of the boy like from a predator, had nearly driven him to flee. The urge had been so strong he had not dared to stir out of fear he would make a mad dash for the jungle, where he might get lost. But now there was not even the slightest need for him to hide from the boy. Instead of this crushing aura there was only some kind of warmth which he by now had only experienced with his friends. It felt like on one of those days on Drum, when the snow was peacefully drifting to the ground and a warm ray of sunshine would make the landscape glisten like diamonds and pearls. It somehow fit the boy more also. Whatever had burst forth from him yesterday did not feel like it even belonged to him but that even sounded strange to his own ears, reason why he had not found the courage to talk with anyone about it, not even Robin who he knew was always very tolerant and open-minded. Gingerly he slid out from behind the door and came up to Naruto who apparently was fascinated by him. He was not looking at him as though he were a monster, instead he looked genuinely interested and a little skeptical, something the doctor could deal with easily. It was such a foreign concept to him. Even Sanji and Luffy had gone ape when they had finally noticed he was no ordinary animal. Nami was an exception but he blamed that on the medication, which would have turned any wild bully into a dovish little lamb. It was a miracle in itself that Nami had been coherent with how high of a fever she had had. Trying his best at remaining professional, he positioned himself next to the boy's leg. He barely reached his knee. Sit down on the bed. I want to see if your wounds healed just fine, Chopper said in an authoritative voice, pawing the boy's knee. But as the boy just threw a confused look his way, it dawned on him that to his great disappointment the boy could not understand a word of what he was saying. At least it looked that way until the blonde settled down on the bed, surveying him. Chopper's and even Robin's jaw dropped, though the reindeer's was close to hitting the floor. Robin recovered in a split second. Did you understand what he was asking you to do? Naruto shook his head, scratching a spot behind his ear. Not really. He said, lower lip protruding, I only got bed and sit but the rest I couldn't understand. Talked way too quickly, did I do something wrong? Barely perceptible for the naked eye, Robin shook her head, not at all. He just wants to take a look at your wounds. He was afraid you might have worsened your condition, seeing how injured you were when you ran off. Something about that statement seemed to amuse him to no end, a cheeky grin showing on his face. It looked so natural, so very differently from yesterday, like night and day. That's all nice and everything, but it takes more to get me down, he piped cheerfully, turning to Chopper. The initial tension was suddenly gone now that he was able to talk about something he was familiar with. Chopper also sensed it, and instantly his posture was calmer and focused. Just like the sudden understanding of simple words, Robin tucked that piece of knowledge away in the back of her mind for later analysis when things would have calmed down a bit. The examination did not take long, and with Robin's help both doctor and patient were spared the troubles which would have undoubtedly resulted from their mutual incomprehension. Robin and Naruto did not have time to have a longer conversation that lasted more than a few minutes, for Chopper would often briefly ask the boy to do something specific, bending his arm, lifting his leg and so on, interrupting the two again and again. After half an hour the little reindeer was done, his furry brow furrowed. He had never seen anything of the likes. "What were you able to assess, Chopper?" Robin inquired. She had just learned from their guest that he was used to hospitals, reason why he was familiar with some of Chopper's commands, although Robin had yet to find out why it was this way for him. The only scrap of information she was able to pick up during their shreds of a conversation was that a friend and teammate of his was fairly proficient in medicine. Chopper shook his head, while he stroked his chin in concentration. "It's incredible, but his bone fracture is practically healed. It might still be a bit sore because of the bruising, but that aside his bone grew back together." He sent her a serious look, and the archaeologist understood immediately. In the first evening of his stay, Chopper had estimated that it would take the boy a month before he would be able to move the limb again. It was no secret on the Sunny that the monster trio and Brook were fast healing, no matter how bad their injuries might be, earning awe and also a bit of envy from other crew members like Usopp or Nami. Usopp's nose could take weeks before being healed completely, while for Zoro or Sanji merely a week sufficed to mend severely bruised ribs, and Brook only needed to drink some milk. As for the Rubber Man, these kinds of injuries were off the cards. Seeing someone with the same regenerative capabilities, which in this case were even off the charts for their standards, was a whole new experience. Naruto looked from one thoughtful expression to the other. "Something wrong?" Robin smiled at him encouragingly. "Not really. Chopper is just curious as to how a fracture that would have taken at least 4 weeks to heal, managed to do so in less than a week." Naruto shrugged innocently, but it did not escape Robin how his jaw cramped a little. Heal fast." The words sounded stretched, as though he had changed his mind about something last minute. He was hiding something. Instead of giving in to her curiosity, Robin simply related the message to Chopper. He looked far from pleased with that vague answer. "No way. Nobody heals that fast," he retorted firmly, although there was no lack of other extremes to prove the opposite of his claim. It so chanced that in this very moment the door to the dining room flew open with a deafening crash like from a cannonball, and that a figure came flying through the room into the infirmary and straight into Naruto. The ninja did not even have the chance to grasp the situation before he ended up on the floor, hit in the head by a tangle of limbs. A shout of rage let the other two stunned occupants of the room flinch, and instead of looking at the two unlucky collapsed people on the floorboards, their eyes wandered to the door where a furious blonde cook was standing. "Didn't Nami tell you not to eat the provisions?" A groan and a came from Naruto and Luffy, who were lying on the floor as dazed heap. The young captain was the first to recover, leaping to his feet, grimacing like a defiant child. "But those fruits looked really yummy. And I didn't see your name written on them," he sulked, sticking out his tongue. "That's not the fucking point," bellowed the cook, who went hurtling towards Luffy even though there were 2 other people in his way and 1 other in his immediate line of firing. Sanji would make sure the idiot rubber head did not forget that kick. For his part did the first thing coming to his mind, so as to prevent of having more than 1 or 2 patients to take care of. Just as Sanji reached the door, did he slam it shut. Wham! The door remained intact, although it was bent to its limits, and a quiet groan could be heard from the other side. All present, even Naruto, who had needed a second or 2 to comprehend what was going on, were sure Sanji was probably lying on the floor, no doubt rubbing at his sore face. Chopper just hoped he hadn't been hurt, but the cook could take far more than this before even having a scratch. Slowly he opened the door, peeping through the tiny crack down at his friend, who indeed lay on the floor stunned. One hand was cradling his head. The absence of blood made Chopper feel a little relieved. With no blood, there was no serious injury. "Sanji, are you all right?" he asked meekly, brave enough to dare and go out of the room and to the cook's side. For a short moment he remained silent while 3 pairs of eyes glanced at him curiously. Soon though the cook stood up again, practically unscathed, save for a red circle now adorning his forehead, making Luffy and Naruto snigger. Once they noticed what they were doing they threw surprised looks at each other. Instantly Luffy was kneeling in front of the ninja, who was still laying halfway on the floor, a wide and excited grin gracing his face. It threw Naruto for a second loop today. "Finally you're awake," the captain announced gleefully, and before anyone could stop him, he slapped him on the back with such force it nearly drove the boy back on the floor. Instead of the aggressive reaction Sanji had been waiting for, the blonde boy just nodded, although it was plainly obvious he was not sure what he was responding to. He probably just did it out of lack of alternatives. Robin quickly came to his aid by translating for him. "Oh, I see." He gave a tentative smile at Luffy as he went to stand up, the captain hovering over him. It was a bit strange, but as long as he did not begin fiddling with him like the small doctor he could tolerate it. Maybe the cook could read minds because he turned to the rubber boy while at the same time trying to hide the large bump on his head with a few strands of hair, contrary to Chopper's wish of putting a band-aid on it. Just what he needed for the stupid Marimo to make fun of him. "Luffy, leave him alone." He looked at Robin. "Had any problems?" "Not in the least. Another night's rest did do him a lot of good. Thanks for the tea, it was excellent," she answered, whereas Sanji gushed that only the best was good enough for her, stood up from her chair. It was becoming rather crowded in the small infirmary. And it was to become even more crowded when Zoro and Brook came running towards them. Still in one piece, Zoro's green mop of hair joined the mix as he let his critical look run over the group. As his and Naruto's gaze met, everybody could hear the boy swallow audibly. What came next though exceeded that nervous reaction by far. "Luffy-san, are you all right?" Brook inquired, standing hunched in the door frame, for he was just too big for the door, the only thing Frankie had not been able to foresee in his blueprints. He did know that such a kick did little to his captain, but that did not mean he couldn't ask anyway. A shriek and a thud let everyone turn their eyes on the boy, who was now for the second time since he had woken up, sitting on the floor. His face was chalk white while he stared at the huge skeleton, eyes so wide the pupils looked minuscule. "Wah wah wah what?" he stammered, and the last bit of color left his face as the skeleton moved again. So it wasn't a figment of his imagination. "That is our musician, Brook," Robin interposed, inclining her head a little in the direction of said person, who automatically turned to her, throwing the boy in another state of panic. After the initial fright, the following reaction of the ninja became more and more amusing. This time even Zoro could not hold it up against him to be overdramatically scared. None of them had had a dignified reaction on the first meeting with their latest crew member. But how is that possible?" he uttered. He recovered from his shock oddly fast, because soon he was up again and inching closer to Brook, skepticism shining bright in his eyes. "Is this some kind of jutsu?" he pressed on, trying to touch the skeleton. His hand just a few inches away from him, though Brook shifted again, recoiled, standing on one leg and hands held up defensively. While Luffy and Chopper parroted him just for fun and Brook surveyed him, both Zoro and Sanji shared one of those rare glances where they agreed on something. That guy was really strange. Robin, preoccupied with not letting the boy alienated like yesterday, enlightened him about the origins of Brook's odd powers just like she had done for him with Chopper. Brook ate the Yomi Yomi no Mi when he had still been alive. It allowed his soul to return to his body even after he died. Naruto's eyebrows were drawn together. "What does a fruit have to do with a jutsu?" "I do not know what a jutsu is, but there are special fruits in this world that grant a person a special power once they eat it." Without warning she made an arm appear on his shoulder and poked his ear. Naruto startled, emitting a yelp. Robin quickly made the limb disappear, but the beginnings of an impish smile were showing on her face. "I did eat such a fruit myself. The Hana no Mi." He seemed to have trouble believing her words. As if on cue, Luffy made himself noticed. "And I'm made of rubber," Luffy stated excitedly, as though he had understood what they had been talking about. To prove his point he stretched his cheek. Even while she was translating, Naruto hesitantly poked the skin on Luffy's biceps before he dared and pinched the skin before stretching it. The captain's skin stretched a good distance. He let go once Luffy started laughing at his shell-shocked expression. Zoro's eyes narrowed once he noticed Luffy giving the boy that unusual look. He probably thought no one would see it, but the swordsman did anyway. Robin for her part noted another peculiar detail about the boy. It was not unusual for people from the Big Blues not to being used to devil fruits, but everyone at least knew about the legends surrounding them. Yet, Naruto did not seem to even be able to make anything of the term itself. She was slowly getting a picture. One which she did not know how to handle properly. A crash on deck made them all wheel around and run out. Usopp, Nami and Frankie were about to prepare the last baskets with fruit they had found edible for storage, also writing down what and how much exactly they were putting in the pantry. In front of the ship lay a row of killed beasts, waiting for Sanji to gut them. They could not see what was the cause for the noise, but it was a safe guess that maybe one of the heavy baskets had fallen down while Usopp and Frankie, who none could see on deck, had hefted them. Nami noticed the arrival of the rest of the crew, pushing her glasses, which she only ever really used when she was drawing maps or making longer notes, up to her hair. Her brown eyes shone with excitement as they settled on Robin, revealing to the archaeologist that she probably wanted to tell her something she would without a doubt like. "Hi Robin, everything all right?" she asked, but left no time to answer, a sign for just how impatient she was to share the good news. Robin did not mind it. She felt happy for how Nami radiated with glee. "We found something on this island that might interest you. Some ruins with the symbols from your notes." Robin was hooked. "We found something on the island that might interest you. Some ruins with the same signs from your records." Of course Robin knew which records were meant. The only ones she maintained for the poneglyphs, in which Nami had seen often enough when she had looked over Robin's shoulder at the pages of a notebook. Every time Robin managed to decipher another piece of the puzzle of history, she updated it. The navigator looked pleased with herself for breaking such good news to her friend. Her gaze went from one familiar face to another until she noticed an additional mop of blonde hair. Then there should only be one. After a few seconds, it clicked. "So you're awake already." Naruto, who was standing next to Luffy, did not notice that he was being addressed even as everyone turned their heads towards him. To him, the ship looked even more inviting in broad daylight. Funny how different things could look at different times of day. He only broke from his reverie when he received a hard nudge in his side. It was the swordsman, and even though Naruto found him redoubtable, he threw an angry glare at him, which he did not relent even when it was being returned with just as much intensity. It just was not like him to feel intimidated by anyone. There was just something in that man's aura that commanded respect. That and the fact that he had dragged that huge animal through the jungle without the use of chakra. By now he was pretty sure that it was that factor that had unconsciously upset him. He had at first assumed they would know about chakra and jutsus and how to use them, but now, after the talk with Robin, it was clear that they had never heard of these things. He had not been as aware of it yesterday, but his gut feeling had been enough to tell him that something was different about that guy and the crew for that matter. How could anyone lift such a monster without chakra control anyway? He himself had needed to enter Sage mode to lift the big frog statue. And once he thought about it now, didn't Jiraiya once mention on their journey that a certain amount of chakra could enhance the strength behind a punch or kick? He himself now often used it without thinking about it, even when he couldn't recall the actual explanation to it. Something about strange coils in muscles and the likes. In hindsight, he regretted not to have listened more attentively. It had just never occurred to him that there might never be a second time to do so. He was once again ripped out of his thoughts, but not as ruggedly as on the first time. "Is something wrong?" Robin's voice was kind, yet she looked thoughtful while she studied him. While Naruto's thoughts had strayed, she had answered Nami's question. Naruto shook his head to clear it a little. "Oh, yeah, everything's fine. Just thinking about things." Everyone stared at him expectantly, and he was unsure what they were hoping for him to do. In that exact moment his stomach decided to growl as loudly as possible. A flush crept from his neck up to his hairline. The ninja made a face, unable to say something that might break the awkward silence. It was Sanji, who spared him any more embarrassment. "I see." he said nonchalantly and lit up a cigarette. Then I'll go and make lunch, should be about time right now. Although Sanji was still cautious and had his reservations concerning the stranger, that was no reason for him to deny food. He had already figured the boy would be starving once he regained consciousness. Chopper had given him infusions with vital nutrients his body had needed to recover and function, but Sanji knew that a small plastic bag with clear liquid could never replace a good meal. While Luffy euphorically bounced after Sanji and Zoro went off, throwing one last look at Naruto, the latter was still flabbergasted about what Robin had just translated for him. He hadn't expected to be treated even remotely nicely by the cook. Nami for her part wasn't as sympathetic as her friend, nor was she as patient. If he's awake already he can come down and help. Or he can sit around and I'll charge him for it, she said, turning around to the ladder that had started to sway mightily again now that Frankie and Usopp had gone back to lifting the crates and baskets. The orange-haired girl had barely finished her sentence when Usopp's large nose appeared over the railing. Nami, I think some of the fruits inside here got squashed. He puffed as he attempted to cautiously put down the crate despite its weight. He wiped his forehead, once freed from his load. Where is everyone else? Ah, he screamed when he spied Naruto on the upper level. Quicker than any other ninja Naruto had ever met, the strange boy sought shelter behind the girl's back, his eyes glued to the blonde. All in all, it made up for a strange picture. Yet he never would have expected the person that came onto deck next. Naruto had seen a lot of things in his life. Tardy senseis, perverts, power-hungry monsters, self-proclaimed gods and peace-bringers, ineffably strong men and women, a man who was half shark, half man, and as of this morning talking skeletons and people made of rubber. With the man who swung himself over the railing, a huge crate under his arm, blue hair and metal nose attached to his face, he was safe to say he could add that one to his collection of odd people too. He was tall but looked somewhat disproportioned. Especially his forearms, which were far too massive and had blue stars tattooed on them. Yet, the thing that made him apart from even his friends was the way his chakra felt like it was not properly flowing through his body. The man did not seem to have noticed him yet, since he was concentrating on the girl and the long-nosed guy. They were discussing something, but Naruto lost interest soon. The few rays of sunlight that had managed to penetrate the blanket of clouds painted bright specks on the lush, green and impenetrable forest and made some spots on the water flash brightly. He practically jumped when suddenly a fist hit him in the shoulder. With a nasty look he turned to the culprit and realized to his amazement that it was the orange-haired girl. As it appeared, he was not the only one who did not agree with her harsh actions. The little reindeer, who had hovered at his side all along, was waving around his hooves furiously. She did not pay him any mind though and fixated Naruto unsmiling. I was being serious earlier, she said, staring at him expectantly. Naruto for his part just made a face, massaging his shoulder, not because it had hurt but simply to show her that he was not keen on this kind of treatment. He was used to something like this from Sakura, but that was the point. This girl was not Sakura. He would not put with this. What was that for? He griped, turning around and staring at her defiantly. At that moment he was just angry he wasn't any taller. Flashing someone a glare usually was more effective when you were not at the same eye level. Well, almost. Damn those high heels. Lucky him for having Robin around and not Sanji. A kick would have been the only thing he would have received instead of the archaeologist's explanation. Nami would like you to help out, she provided calmly, yet when her and the navigator's eyes met one could see a silent reprimand in them. Nami for her part seemed to understand. Sighing, she crossed her arms. She was saying something but Naruto was unsure whether it was meant for him or not. She apologizes. Robin translated, looking very pleased, but she insists you lend them a hand, since you seem to have recuperated. She paused briefly and a small grin flitted over her face. She also wants you to know she will charge you otherwise, since we were generous enough to take you in. The grin stretched a little, starting with medical equipment and the time she spent looking after you when you were still unconscious. Naruto's jaw went slack. That's theft. Robin couldn't help but chuckle a little at his indignant outburst. Everyone on deck stared at the duo, but it was like they were in their own little world. Frankie and the others could only watch how they exchanged a few more words, the boy crossing his arms at some point, sighing deeply and dramatically, his chin coming to rest on his chest. Finally he turned to Nami, snorted determinedly before jumping over the low rail and onto the grass, making his way towards Usopp and Frankie. Chopper's protests were either being ignored or not understood. No one, except maybe Robin, could really tell. He came to a halt just in front of the carpenter, arms outstretched, palms of his hands turned upward and wiggling his fingers in a manner they unmistakably indicated towards him. Frankie was astonished that a guy, who was barely any taller than Nami, wanted to take such a heavy load. Those blue eyes were looking up at him expectantly and a little curiously. The little guy did not look like someone who'd give up, even when Frankie would refuse to hand over the box. Wondering what might happen, and to Chopper's dismay he let the crate change hands. That did not mean that he withdrew instantly, just in case it did become too much for the tiny guy. The boy doubled up a little, but just before Frankie could decide to take the load away, he stood up straight and speedily ran towards the only open door on deck, disappearing inside. There was a pregnant pause on deck until a confused shout rung out from the inside of the ship. Robin, who was amused by her friend's flabbergasted expressions, informed them that Naruto had trouble finding the storage room. Usopp and Frankie both blinked before the cyborg ran off to help the overchallenged teenager. Usopp, Brook and Chopper were dumbfounded. To Robin's left Nami groaned, "Can't we, just for once, pick up someone normal?" Robin simply smiled into her hand discreetly. "Tiny bro here's got a lot of strength," Frankie announced loudly while they all sat at the table, enjoying what Sanji had been able to prepare with the few exotic ingredients at his disposal. He had even been lucky enough to find some, which in their uncooked state Luffy had not tried to devour. 3 pairs of eyes, mainly Luffy's, Zoro's and Sanji's, were looking at him intently. "Really now?" asked Zoro, derisively. Frankie did not comment on it. "Ow, carried many of the crates that are really heavy, even for me." Sanji's only visible eyebrow rose, while Luffy continued chewing on a haunch, sparing the boy a furtive glance. If Zoro had heard the remark, he didn't show. An indignant shout made them turn their heads towards Naruto, who had gone red in the face, looking furiously at Frankie as though the carpenter. Robin sat beside him, seemingly enjoying everyone's confusion. "What's up with you?" inquired the blue-haired man, since the boy would not relent with his glare. "He does not like the nickname," Robin clarified while sliding the meat on her plate towards an outstretched rubber hand. At once, everyone burst out laughing, making Naruto's face resemble a tomato. "Well, sorry bro, but you really are tiny." Peeved, the blonde turned around, back to his plate. A quiet escaped him when he noticed there was nothing left. So Robin's warning had not been a joke. Their captain really was glutton. The fact that the straffut wearer was grinning at him from under rim of his hat was evidence enough. Naruto's eyes flashed, and with swiftness no one would have thought him capable of, he snatched away a piece of meat right from under the rubber man's nose. "Hey!" he cried out as Naruto ripped off a huge chunk of meat, swallowing exaggeratedly. Both looked at each other challengingly, and Sanji could hear alarm bells ringing inside his head. And surely both opponents readied themselves for a battle that came to a premature and sudden end when a black, polished shoe hit them both on the head. And clutching his head, Naruto threw a withering glare at the cook. "Keep quiet, damn it, no fighting at the table," he clamored, before he sat down with a watchful eye and a deep-set frown. Even though he did not understand, Naruto was smart enough not to try anything risky afterwards. The rest of the meal was relatively calm, and although he did not admit it out loud, Naruto was impressed by the swirly brows cooking and the general mayhem. Most dishes he did not know, and the green stuff he didn't even dare touch, but the meat as well as the soups were really delicious. At one point he had surprised Robin with a question concerning the lack of broth for a plate of long, thin noodles. She replied that this was actually normal. He could not help but riposte. "What? No, just no, you can't do that. Noodles are supposed to be served with soup." "A soup, I tell you. Whoever came up with something so stupid? Yuck." He was not sure if it was due to his wildly flailing arms or the comment itself, but Robin seemed to be trying hard not to look too amused. To his utter horror, she seemed to have passed the message to the cook, since after a second or two he at first gave him a speechless look, and then his features slowly turned into a gleeful smile. But it slowly died away the longer the cook watched him, until finally he looked downright glum. Naruto was at a loss, but that was because he of course could not know that Sanji was currently being the fact that had gotten himself another big eater. It did not matter if the boy hadn't eaten in days, no one except his captain could gobble down that much food. Robin and Nami though were discussing what the exploration group had found in the forest. "A dome you say?" Robin inquired, leaning against the wall and relaxing. Nami nodded, took a sip from her orange juice through a clear drinking straw and casually leaned on the table. "Exactly. If you take Usopp along, you should be able to find it easily enough. He is good at spotting enemy ships from miles away after all." Robin just nodded, stroking her chin with a finger, deep in thought. "Do you know who you want to take along?" Nami wanted to know. Before Robin even had a chance to answer, Luffy practically threw himself at them, making Zoro's nose collide painfully with the rim of the glass the swordsman was holding. "I'm coming too, I wanna see it." Robin smiled kindly while Zoro and Luffy squabbled. Luffy wanted him to come along, his main point being that Zoro had not seen the mystery ruins too. Zoro for his part just wanted some peace and quiet and a nap. Everyone knew that in the end Luffy would get what he wanted. "Please take me with you," Chopper cried out hopefully, and the archaeologist understood all too well. Since he had stayed behind on the ship this morning he had not seen anything but the island's beach. Brook as well did not miss his chance. "Allow me to accompany you." Robin glanced at Nami shortly and contentedly. "Here you have your expeditionary group." Yet something seemed to bother her friend. "And what about the boy?" the navigator whispered at last, an uncertain expression on her face. It was nothing personal on Nami's part. She was simply convinced that they would end up in an uncomfortable situation, should Robin not be there to assist with her linguistic skills. Robin herself had not thought about it, not as conscious about the barrier between the crew and Naruto caused by the difference in language. Surprisingly, Sanji shared his thoughts on the matter. He had listened to their conversation attentively. He could always stay in Chopper's room, he suggested without hesitation or a shred of sympathy, slowly exhaling smoke. With one look at the boy, who seemingly had gotten over Frankie's unintended offensive remark, and seeing him gape at the hairline cross and cannon built into the cyborg's arm, she instantly knew that it was not a good solution. As he was now, sitting there and trying in any possible way to communicate with the older man, she was sure he gave as much of a hoot about sitting still as Luffy. Locking him up in a small room like some leper or captive might make him revert to the wary teenager they had witnessed yesterday evening. It was a situation she wanted to avoid at all costs. An idea formed in her head, an idea she knew neither Sanji nor Nami would approve of, yet she did not shy away from bringing it forth. "And what about taking him along?" As she had expected, both cook and navigator looked at her aghast. They had no trust in a stranger they couldn't understand and who just yesterday had tried to attack them. To make matters worse, at least in Sanji's opinion, was that both his angels had been threatened. "Robin," Nami said while looking at her as if she instead of Luffy had suggested they do something reckless, "are you sure this is a good idea?" At her concerned voice the rest of the crew began listening in as well. The one the whole conversation focused on looked perplexedly from one person to the next before giving up with a silent huff. "Robin Kwan, you can't really mean that." It was obvious that Sanji was not pleased with the idea of one of his lovely ladies to go off into the jungle without him watching out for their safety. It did not matter who else would tag along. She had anticipated these questions. "I do think so," she replied evenly, "but the decision is up to the captain." She looked at Luffy, who for the first time since he had come back aboard the Sunny did not bounce up and down. Yet the huge grin on his face and the anticipation in his big brown eyes were unmistakable. They all knew what his decision would be, before he had even uttered a word. Naruto had no other choice but to let himself be dragged off by the hyperactive teenager to look for suitable clothes, since Chopper had pointed out that going into the forest with his light clothing was not something he would recommend. Thin cotton was not a good protection. Robin barely had time to explain what they had in mind for him when Luffy had dragged him out the door, inside the boys' cabin and out of sight. The crew still was staring at the kitchen door through which their captain and the ninja had left. It was normal for Luffy to be excited when they reached new islands and met new people, but this level of eagerness was new even to them. Luffy usually could not care less about what clothes to wear to go exploring unless of course there were Amores available. Him suddenly taking that matter in his own hands was quite baffling. "Well," Nami said, blinking and then getting up, "I will tend to my maps. I should have everything I need." She added more to herself while exiting the room. Frankie followed her example. "Ow, I'll finish up the stowage. I'll also fix the lock." Sanji nodded at him in thanks. This was, at the moment, his main concern. As long as the lock was not in place and no one else had an eye on the kitchen, he could not leave. Not if he wanted to risk Luffy breaking in again. In meantime he could prepare the next lunch boxes. Usopp and Chopper disappeared under deck, probably to check out one of the Tinkerer's new inventions before they had to depart. Robin thanked him for the meal, even offered to help clear the table, which the cook rejected though. Instead he made Brook and, with much complaining, Zoro stay for the task. Once everything was in the sink, Sanji let Brook leave and kept the Marimo in the kitchen for washing up. He would have preferred someone else's company at the moment, but he had come to realize that bones, especially wet bones, were inept to hold plates, much less to wipe them dry. Too bad many plates had to be broken for him to see that issue. Quickly and in silence, Sanji handed the spinach head one plate after the next. Only once he ran short of dishes and only the silverware remained, did he notice that the swordsman had not directed a single unfriendly word at him. Inconspicuously, he glanced at his rival. Zoro was handling one of the knives with so much force, Sanji was only waiting for it to burst. But more than his hands, it was the man's face that spoke volumes. Something was going on and Sanji just knew it had to do with the stranger. "What's wrong?" he asked finally, but never faltering in his rhythm with which he scrubbed down the cutlery. Zoro for his part had not anticipated any questions, hadn't anticipated for anyone to notice. Automatically he wanted to answer in his usual manner, telling the cook to mind his own business, yet the urge to do so died down, the words never making it to his mouth. Was something the matter? Well, a strange guy had popped up out of nowhere and Luffy was acting odd, maybe. Robin usually was a very composed woman, so it was hard to notice, but her wanting to talk to the stranger was undeniable. Why at first had not been clear, but since yesterday he had understood that it had to a small extent to do with the language the boy was speaking. Apparently it had something to do with her ambitions. It sounded reasonable enough. Luffy though was a whole different matter. His captain had, much to the crew's chagrin, the attention span of a goldfish. It was not unusual for him to get interested in something just to run off a few minutes later to look for something new to do. The same applied to the crew when they were at sea for longer periods of time. One moment Luffy was bugging Usopp, the next he would disturb his first mate's sleep. Yet, he felt as though his captain was fixated on the stranger. It was not that obvious, but it was noticeable, at least to him, and he did not know what to think of it. What had him worried was the possibility of charging blindly into something, when they knew nothing of the situation at hand. Although up until now that's always how they did things and they always had overcome every challenge that had been thrust at them. He would continue to trust in Luffy. That had often turned out to be nerve-wracking but nonetheless right. "Nothing," he finally grumbled, "so just leave me alone." Sanji gave him a half-hearted insult in response. His involuntary pause had not gone unnoticed and Zoro was aware of it. Naruto brushed off his new attire, looking around the room which now resembled a battlefield. Several shirts and shorts were lying as well as pants were lying on the floor or over the edge of the hanging beds. It reminded him somewhat of the state his own room used to be in, but he did not want to follow that train of thought any further. It was nothing but a painful stab. The rubber man stood before, rummaging in a pile of jackets that decreased more and more in size as he looked for something that his guest might like and maybe match the black pants and the ultramarine shirt he had been given already. His Hittite had found a place around his neck again, and surprisingly his sandals had been returned to him. It was funny to watch how the raven-haired boy was searching so avidly, looking like he was enjoying every moment of it, like a little searching for his favorite toy. Despondently Naruto watched. When was the last time he had felt that way? When everything had still been so simple? He couldn't remember, could not recall what it felt like to laugh, not because the situation demanded him to, but because he truly felt like it. It was as if those moments were part of his imagination. A bundle of black and orange took up his field of vision and he was at once back on the sunny, the boys' cabin where Luffy shoved a jacket with his favorite color into his face. He was talking about something, but Naruto still could not understand anything. Still, he took the item and looked at it more closely. It was a simple black jacket with short sleeves, fiery orange streaks crossing the dark color material, leading to the collar and the seam. It was plain, but he liked it. It did resemble his old one at least somewhat. He gave Luffy a thankful nod, making the boy's grin widen even more. Naruto wondered if this was only possible because he was made of rubber, Luffy urging him to quickly put it on. Apparently he could not wait to leave now that this problem had been solved. He bounced through the door, screaming something that roused the crew. He was on deck last but happened to be second on the beach when Luffy grabbed him by the wrist, dragging him after him. For some reason it did not bother Naruto as it should have. Luffy's glee was contagious, and for the first time in many days, Naruto actually managed to return a smile that was not too forced. And even though a quiet voice in the back of his mind tried to remind him of the trials still lying ahead, he did not let that drag him down. Robin watched the course of events with contentedly while climbing down the ladder, the rest of their exploration group following behind, each laughing about Zoro's complaint as to why the boy was again wearing one of his jackets. Swinging from branch definitely was a great. Not that Naruto hadn't tried it out as a child, but as a ninja it became a sort of unwritten rule that you were not to move in trees in such a childish fashion. At the moment those rules did not apply to him, and his new companion radiated with such energy and cheerfulness that it was hard to resist the temptation of just letting go. By now even Usopp had joined them up in the trees, his brown eyes still surveying him, and so the loud trio they rushed on ahead, spooking all kinds of animals and creatures, hiding in the shade of a plant or on the hunt. Further behind, battling their way through undergrowth were Zoro, Robin, Brook and Chopper, following there, three little monkeys with their eyes and soaking in the impressions from the jungle surrounding them. Chopper would stop from time to time, either because a bug or a certain plant's scent caught his interest. The musician would stay close, so as not to leave the small reindeer by himself, leaving Robin to be in the company of a scowling swordsman. Robin watched as their guest did not seem to notice any of the heated glares, boring themselves somewhere at the back of his head. The swordsman was unhappy, if with the situation as a whole or another circumstance she was not aware of, she did not know. It was too early to address this subject. Who wasn't to say that at the end of today they and the stranger might go separate ways? Usopp, she called, and promptly the group of three came to a halt. Three heads turned their heads towards her in interest. Is it still far away? The sniper nodded quickly, grabbed his googles and adjusted them. He seemed to locate something in the distance. Only a few minutes, if any. Robin smiled appreciatively. Discovering new ruins and unveiling the secrets of the past were some of the few things besides her crew that could fill her with so much happiness. They went on ahead until they stood under the very branch that Luffy and Usopp were occupying, pondering over whether they should try and open one of the rock-hard nuts they had just spotted. "Stop dawdling and get moving," shouted Zoro up at them while one of Robin's hands kept him from marching deeper into the forest and into the opposite direction. "Okay," Luffy replied loudly, turning back around to Zoro's surprise. "Hey, Naruto. We're going." Indeed, the ninja was standing further away on another thick branch, staring spellbound at a certain spot in the mass of green they couldn't see. Yet he did not turn to face them when Luffy had called for him. His blue eyes were wide with what they could only guess to be consternation. Before anyone could anticipate it, the ninja had disappeared, a creaking branch and the wild rustling of leaves the only indication that he had just bolted. Naruto didn't even hear the cries anymore. There was only one thing he had to focus on, and that was not to lose sight of the person he had just spotted. Arrow Sennin. He would recognize that mane of silvery hair anywhere. They had all been wrong. Jiraiya was stronger than to let himself get killed by pain. Maybe he had stranded in this far-off place as well and gone into hiding to heal from his injuries. Maybe like him, he was stuck and had waited for some ship to come by. That had to be it. Naruto actually did not want to allow himself to feel the excitement building up inside him. With the Arrow Sennin's help everything would be alright. Yet, his hope was dulled by the fact that instead of slowing down his former sensei picked up in speed as Naruto called out to him. Had he not managed to gather his wits again, he would not have been able to evade a tree that might have become a painful obstacle to him. Why was Jiraiya trying so hard to shake him off? There was no need to hide anymore. Jiraiya! He cried one last time, hoping the old man would stop and finally turn around. But it never happened. As he left the last branches behind him and jumped into a wide-open clearing, Naruto realized just how much of a fool he had been. High up in the clear crowns of the trees with vines connecting them, and on the grassy forest floor sat monkeys, watching the newcomers in their territory with interest and caution. Only now, with sunlight able to light everything, no more leafage there to hold it back, the ninja was able to discern what he had thought to be the eremite's long tuft of pale hair to be nothing but a thick and fluffy stripe of white fur on the monkeys' tails. The primates were unusually big but lanky with black fur, but their long tails, which were even longer the rest of their bodies, instantly attracted attention with their bright hair. Naruto felt as though someone had smashed his own Rasengan in his gut. How stupid had he been to believe that this was the old pervert? Now that he had come to his senses again, he finally took notice of the energy that was flowing from those creatures, so very different from humans and even less the old eremite. He did not mind the monkeys, slowly crowding around him, their big yellow eyes examining him. Some of them were bold enough to reach out their long, dark fingers for his legs only to shrink back when their skin came into contact with the fabric of his pants. Naruto's heart hurt too much to spare them any attention. The wish to see the old man did not lessen any. An ineffable ruckus disturbed the quiet of the clearing. At once the monkeys sought shelter high up in the trees, their amber eyes wide open in fright, screeching and hissing, their fur bristled menacingly. Naruto turned his head to see both Luffy and Usopp, the latter in his captain's grasp, dashing out of between gigantic ferns. He stepped aside quickly, evading the two human cannonballs. While the captain and sniper faltered and then painfully hit the ground, the rest of the party came out of the undergrowth, alarmed and out of breath. It seemed he hadn't made the chase all too easy for them. The swordsman seemed most irritated of all. The man hissed a few harsh words at him, probably an insult or two as well. Robin for her part did not even try to translate and Naruto simply ignored it. He did not feel compelled to argue. "You shouldn't take off like that," said Robin, looking not as winded as the other crew members. She scanned their surroundings. These lemurs do not look threatening nor dangerous, but there are far bigger animals hunting in this jungle, as you should be aware of. Naruto weakly shrugged his shoulders. Even if so, I'll be able to manage now. The archaeologist watched him with a thoughtful expression when Zoro suddenly came up from behind the blonde and knocking him upside the head with Shisui's hilt. "Stop running off, damn it," he snapped, annoyed by the lasting, unwanted chase he had to be part of ever since they had taken in the brat. The hit seemed to do what no kind words would have been able to, because at once the boy was glaring fiercely and challengingly back at him. Naruto would not take any more of this, no matter if the guy was a monster or not. Zoro returned the look just as angrily, incited by the boy's bravery that seemed to become more apparent the more they confronted each other. Their silent and angry stare down was disrupted by a loud shout. "Whoa, this is so cool." They all turned towards Luffy, whose finger pointed at something ahead. Everyone's jaws went slack, except for Usopp and Robin, who both seemed rather content and proud. Hidden behind the trees of the forest, cut into rock face of pale pink, towered a voluminous dome. Although the jungle was lush and thriving around the site, the smooth polished stone remained untouched by nature, revealing intertwined ornaments much more detailed and more beautiful than any foliage could be. A ring of plain columns supported it. At the end of a staircase, each step the height of a normal person, was a gigantic gaping entrance. The Sunny would have fit through it 3 times. Slowly they got closer to it, except Luffy, who stretched, grabbed one of the columns and catapulted himself onto the highest step. "Come on, guys, this looks awesome," he screamed, hurrying inside despite Usopp's protests. Robin found it interesting that she could hear her captain's every step even outside. The steps were enormous. One had to wonder who had built this colossal structure. It stood to reason to consider giants, though there wasn't nearly enough evidence to prove that theory. The climb was tedious, especially for those who did not possess great jumping powers or convenient devil fruits. "They take really long," Naruto said sulkily while he waited at the top of the stairs with Robin beside him, who could not resist letting the corners of her mouth twitch upwards. "Why the hell are you already up there?" Usopp grouched, struggling with getting onto the next step with help from Chopper and Brook. Zoro though did not allow himself to get distracted and instead persistently climbed, arriving before them. In the time they had managed to get up at last, the others had already started exploring the ring and examining the front behind it. Sketchbook in hand, Robin committed the shapes of enormous animals that were decorating the wall as a bold relief, on paper with expert lines. Cats, tortoises, raccoon, dogs, even some slugs was what she could pinpoint in that tangle of shapes, yet the signification of the picture was lost to any normal beholder because of its sheer size. She looked around and let an eye sprout in one of the highest edges of a column. What now presented itself to her was the image of a battle between behemoths which by her observations extended to the other side of the wall as well. It was truly a masterpiece and a miracle that time and weather and any sorts of civilizations had spared this place. It was as if time did not exist here. Pretty impressive, huh? Asked Usopp as he came to stand beside the archaeologist. As one of the artistically more gifted Straw Hats, the relief also was of interest to him. Without a doubt, Robin replied while making notes and letting more eyes appear around the whole structure. The people who built this must have been very knowledgeable at their craftsmanship. A sight of this grandeur could never be the work of an uncivilized culture. The book shut with a snap. Let's go in, shall we? Usopp nodded and together they went to the entrance where Brook was already waiting. The rest of their merry group was already inside. If the sight of the exterior was able to make people awe, then Robin did not know what word to use to describe how she felt as she entered the dome. The pink hue of the stone gave the hall a warm glow, making it so different from other gravesites or sanctuaries or cathedrals that Robin had already explored and that were all united by the same coldness their pale stone emitted. Light penetrated through a hole in the dome ceiling. The ground was embellished by a glass mosaic of many colors, once again too big to be properly comprehended. Yet, what instantly demanded the attention of anyone entering the hall were the 9 statues standing in a near-perfect circle, their expressionless directed at the intruders of their temple. 9 animals, some of which she recognized from the relief outside. Tobin let her eyes wander over the 4 to her left and the 4 to her right. On the left came first a raccoon dog, then a tortoise, a slug and finally a rhinoceros beetle, which Luffy couldn't help but investigate thoroughly and enthusiastically. As long as he did not damage it beyond repair, he was free to have his fun. Opposite of those animals stood a cat, an ape, a horse and an octopus, which differently from his stone companions did not stand upon his socket upright but had twined its long tentacles around it as though ready to crush it to dust. And in their midst, where both rows met, a huge fox stood tall and proud. Once Robin noticed what he was leaning on with his small 4 paws, her eyes light up. Bar the characters, the Decagon had nothing in common with the objects that usually made her chest tingle with excitement. Yet, despite its unusual shape and its even more extraordinary shine, there was no doubt in Robin's mind that this was indeed a poneglyph. While the others still climbed up the statues, she slowly went to the stone. It was smooth and unblemished with no scratches or signs of being worn by time. She could even see her own reflection as she stood in front of it, stretching out her hand. The surface was cool to the touch, she noticed, tracing the sharp edge of one of the sunken characters carefully with the tips of her fingers. Depending on the angle one looked at it, colors seemed to rush over it like on an oily sheen. Something else that got her attention was the fact that the ray of light from the opening above hovered just inches over the poneglyph and it was just early afternoon. In her silent marvel she had forgotten the world around her. Still, she did not even flinch when suddenly a pair of curious blue eyes appeared next to her. "What are you doing?" Robin went to face the boy instead of the poneglyph. Naruto had decided that Zoro's go at lifting one of the statues was not that interesting. Even he had come to understand that superhuman strength was needed to lift something that massive, provided it was not attached to the floor. With Senjutsu he might be able to do it, but he would not want to bet on it. Also, Zoro had Luffy and the others to cheer him on and to pitch in. There was also something else. He was not sure what it was exactly, only that it had to do with the statues. They made him uneasy, or maybe not all of them, only the fox with its eyes glinting down on them. He was not unlike Kyuubi, though he lacked the trademark 9 tails that belonged to that being, like his blonde hair to him. He shook his head and went through his blonde mop. Maybe he was interpreting too much into it. A queasy feeling settled in his stomach when he thought about the fox. The memory of the near loss of his humanity during his fight against pain was still fresh. Truthfully, he should be keeping an eye on the demon, but at the moment all he wanted was to keep as far away as possible from it. What came actually as a surprise was the realization that the fox had been rather quiet for a while now, but it gave him a good enough excuse to avoid another chat with the Ninetails. Robin watched him but answered his question, once he seemed to have collected his thoughts. This is a poneglyph. It tells the history of the Void Century. She let her hand rest on the stone tenderly. Normally they are cubes and made of harder, rougher stone, but this one seems to fulfill a different purpose than the ones I was able to decipher up until now. She turned to him again with a faintly noticeable smile. There was expectation shining in her eyes, but she never voiced it. Naruto blinked and looked at her and then the stone. He seemed amazed. "You can read this?" "Yes." His brow furrowed slightly, but it was the lost expression on his face that caught her completely off guard, just like the words he said next. "And what does it say?" Robin seriously considered getting her ears checked by Chopper. "Excuse me?" she inquired, barely managing to keep her composure. This was not an answer she had seen coming. The ninja looked sheepish, digging his hands in the pockets of his jacket and began tapping his feet nervously. Naruto was convinced he must have done something wrong because the expression on Robin's face, her eyes wide and staring at him disbelievingly, couldn't mean anything good. "I've never seen such strange scribbles. They look nothing like the ones at home." Robin's thoughts were running a mile, the poneglyph the least of her concerns. She had assumed he could read the language as well as he could read it. It had never occurred to her that this logical way of thinking might be wrong. She had also come up with different theories, up in the library by herself when she had taken out her records, when she had had enough time to analyze what she had found out about Naruto, thinking about where he could come from, or rather from which era. Up until now she had contemplated the idea of him coming from the past. It would have fit in a strange sense and wasn't a possibility she would have ruled out after the incident in the Rainbow Mist. His proficiency at the language had been her major lead. And the scales fell from her eyes. In her excitement and eagerness she had, for the very first time, gotten carried away. By Professor Clover's standards, an unforgivable mistake. She should at least have tried to prove her point. But if he was unable to read the characters, making that theory void, what other had to take its place? And once again, she found herself at square one. Who was the boy? The end. Now we will see you in the next video.